Hi, I'm Jason, a 21-year-old who's been through more than most at my age. Growing up, I always felt like I was in the way. After my parents divorced when I was 10, my life became a ping-pong game. Mom had her new boyfriend, and Dad was quickly remarried. Neither of them seemed to remember they had a son who needed a place to call home. I just needed to figure things out. Jason, you'll stay with your dad for a while, Mom said, avoiding my eyes as she packed up my room into boxes. Dad was no better. Your mom should be taking care of this, not me, he muttered when I arrived with my bags. The back and forth continued, each day growing shorter and their patience thinner. You know, Jason, maybe it would be easier if you stayed with your Aunt Marie just until we sort things out, Dad suggested one day, not even trying to hide his relief when I agreed. Aunt Marie was different. Her home was small, but her heart was huge. You're welcome here as long as you need, Jason, she said, the first time someone made me feel wanted in years. Why don't they want me, Aunt Marie? I asked one night, the weight of my parents' neglect heavy on my young shoulders. It's not about you, Jason, it's their loss, not yours, she replied, her words a balm to my aching heart. Living with Aunt Marie wasn't just about having a roof over my head, it was about building a life. Every school morning started with her famous pancakes and ended with her at the kitchen table, helping me with homework. She was more than a guardian, she was my biggest fan and toughest critic all rolled into one. You're smarter than you think, Jason, apply yourself, and you'll go far, she'd say, pushing me to dig deeper in my studies. Under her guidance, I started excelling in school. It wasn't just about making good grades, it was about proving to myself that I could be someone who wasn't defined by my parents' abandonment. Every A on a test, every successful project, wasn't just a win for me, it was a win for us. As I grew older, interactions with my parents became increasingly rare and emotionally distant. Phone calls on birthdays or a card during the holidays were the extent of their efforts, each one feeling more like an obligation they couldn't wait to fulfill. Hey sport, how's school? Dad would ask with an almost scripted detachment. It's going well, thanks, I'd reply, keeping it brief. The calls usually ended as quickly as they started, leaving a hollow feeling that lingered a bit longer each time. But Aunt Marie's presence made up for it all. She was there for every important moment, my first soccer goal, my high school graduation, and every small victory in between. It's not where you come from, Jason, it's where you're going, remember that, she'd remind me whenever I felt the sting of parental neglect. By the time I was ready for college, I had grown into a strong, independent young man, largely due to her influence. Aunt Marie drove me to college orientations, helped me fill out applications, and celebrated with me when the acceptance letters came in. We did it, Aunt Marie, I told her the day I got my acceptance to State University, my first choice. We sure did, kiddo, she replied, her eyes misty with pride. Her unwavering support wasn't just about fulfilling a duty, it was about providing me with the foundation of love and encouragement every child deserves. As I moved into my college dorm, looking back at her waving from the car, I knew that no matter where life took me, the lessons she taught me and the love she gave would always be with me, guiding me forward. The news came during my sophomore year of college. My grandfather, whom I hadn't seen much since I was a kid due to my parents' split but whom I loved very much, had passed away. The news hit me like a thunderbolt, a shock I hadn't anticipated, but the real surprise wasn't just his passing, it was what he left behind for me. According to his will, I was to inherit $1 million. I remember sitting in the lawyer's office, feeling a mix of grief and disbelief. Your grandfather always spoke highly of you, Jason, he believed in your future, the lawyer told me as he handed over the documents. I was overwhelmed. My grandfather had watched from a distance, but still saw something in me worth believing in. It was a stark contrast to my parents, who seemed to have forgotten I existed unless it was convenient for them. The inheritance felt like a validation of my efforts and my worth, a reward for all the pain caused by my parents' neglect and abandonment. But it also brought an unexpected complication, the sudden reappearance of my parents. Almost overnight, they were back in my life, their affection overflowing in a way that felt jarring and insincere. Jason, we've missed you so much, Mom said over the phone, her voice dripping with an emotion that didn't quite reach her words. We were just thinking about how long it's been since we all got together, Dad added, as if years of neglect could be brushed aside. Their timing seemed too coincidental to be genuine. It was clear they were aware of the inheritance, and it pained me to realize their sudden interest was likely driven by the knowledge of that $1 million. The calls and messages increased, each filled with feigned concern and hollow sentiments. "We should catch up, Jason. It's been too long," Mom would say, but all I could hear was the unspoken, "We should talk about that money." I found myself in a tough position, torn between the desire to finally have my parents back and the nagging suspicion that their motivations were purely financial. The internal conflict was exhausting, and I leaned heavily on Aunt Marie's wisdom. "They're your parents, Jason, but be careful," she cautioned, her protective nature always at the forefront. "People don't change overnight." As the reality of their intentions became clearer, I braced myself for the inevitable confrontation. I knew I had to confront their sudden change of heart head-on, and I braced myself for what was quickly shaping up to be a significant conflict, one that would test not just my resolve, but the very nature of our familial bonds. The pressure built rapidly after my parents re-entered my life, with each conversation subtly steering towards finances. It wasn't long before the veil was lifted entirely. During a particularly blunt call, my father laid out their true intentions with unsettling clarity. "Jason, I've got some debts that have piled up, and your siblings need support for their education. You have the means to help," Dad said, his voice a mix of faint casualness and desperation. The word family suddenly became a tool wielded with precision to guilt me into opening my wallet. My initial shock at the directness of his request quickly turned to frustration. "We haven't really been a family for years, Dad. Why am I only hearing from you now, and only when you need something?" I countered, my voice firm despite the turmoil inside. "It's not like that, Jason. We've always cared about you," Mom chimed in, her tone soothing but lacking sincerity. The conversation escalated into a confrontation as I challenged their sudden affection. "You can't just walk back into my life and expect me to solve your problems. Where were you when I needed you?" I demanded. "We made mistakes, Jason. We're trying to make things right," Dad replied, his voice strained, but their apologies felt empty and their reasons self-serving. The more we talked, the clearer their motives became, and my resolve only strengthened. I remembered all those years with Aunt Marie, the stability and love she provided without expecting anything in return. That was what family was supposed to be. "No, I can't help you," I finally stated, each word solidifying my decision. "I have my own life to build and responsibilities that don't include fixing your mistakes." The silence that followed was telling. The disappointment was palpable. But with the pain of the confrontation came a deep sense of relief. I had stood up for myself, establishing boundaries that were long overdue. As I sat back, the weight of the conversation pressing down on me, I recognized it as a pivotal moment, one that redefined the dynamics of our relationship. I was no longer the child left behind. I was an adult taking control of my life and my choices. The confrontation, though painful, was necessary. It marked a significant turning point in my journey, reinforcing my independence and my commitment to live a life defined not by the past, but by the values and people who truly mattered. With the decision to stand firm made, I knew I needed to ensure my future and my inheritance were protected. I met with a lawyer to explain the situation and my intentions to invest wisely and secure both my and Aunt Marie's futures. The lawyer advised me on setting up trusts and investment accounts that would safeguard the money and allow it to grow responsibly. "Let's make sure your financial future is as secure as possible, Jason. You've got a good head on your shoulders," the lawyer remarked, approving of my plans to prioritize education and long-term investments. With legal protections in place, I felt a profound sense of relief. For the first time in a long time, I was making decisions entirely on my own, free from manipulation or guilt. Returning home to Aunt Marie, who had been my rock throughout this entire ordeal, I sat at our old kitchen table, the same one where we'd shared countless meals and conversations. I told her everything. "Aunt Marie, I've taken care of the inheritance. There's something else. I've set up a fund for us, for the home improvements you've always talked about and maybe even a trip to Europe, like you've always wanted," I said, watching her reaction closely. Tears welled up in her eyes as she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Jason, you didn't have to do that. I didn't take care of you for any of this." "I know, Aunt Marie," I replied, my voice thick with emotion, "but you gave me a family when I had none. You deserve everything and more. You are the most deserving person of this money. You're the one who took care of me, taught me love, and gave me attention. You are my true mother." The realization of what family truly meant had never been clearer. Family wasn't just about blood relations. It was about who stood by you during your lowest moments, who supported you without conditions, and who loved you unconditionally. Aunt Marie was my family in every way that mattered. Reflecting on the entire journey, I understood that the love and support she provided were the true essence of family. I came to realize that the challenges I faced with my parents were not merely obstacles, but valuable lessons that had fortified my resolve and deepened my understanding of loyalty and love. As I looked to the future, I felt more confident and secure in who I was and in my ability to navigate whatever life might present. With Aunt Marie by my side and a clear path ahead, I was ready to embrace new possibilities. I understood that true wealth wasn't measured by my bank account but by the relationships that had endured and the resilience I had gained. The clarity about what truly matters and the strength to stand up for myself were the real inheritances from my grandfather and father. These lessons would guide me long after the money was spent, ensuring that I lived a life rich in love and integrity, a life that Aunt Marie and I would build together. That concludes our story. Now, here's a question for you. Is it ever justifiable to cut off family members financially if they only show interest when they want something? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. If you found this story impactful, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more thought-provoking content. Your support helps us bring these stories to light. Let's continue the conversation and explore these complex family dynamics together.
Deborah and her grandmother lived on the outskirts of the village, near the forest, and often went there to collect medicinal herbs. The grandmother was considered a healer by all the neighbours, who often turned to her for help to get their husbands out of a binge, to increase milk production for nursing mothers, or to strengthen a man's vitality. However, they had enemies too, who considered them witches and avoided the herbalist's house like the plague. Deborah did not know her parents at all. Her grandmother had always been by her side for as long as she could remember. It was not difficult for her to understand that her grandma simply healed with herbs, which Mother Nature generously gave them every summer. She herself already knew the name and power of each herb growing in her beloved forest. But shortly, Deborah's happy childhood came to an end. Grandma fell ill and never got up. The one who had helped other people all her life could not help herself. "Deborah, don't cry for me. When I die, I will always be with you. Don't be afraid. Go to people. Just be careful. Look them in the heart. Don't let vile people near you. You have the light in you. Don't lose it. And if trouble happens, I will come to you in a dream and tell you where to find the truth." The grandmother died at dawn. Neighbours helped Deborah bury her. Returning from the funeral, the girl looked around. The orphaned house now seemed somehow foreign without her dear grandmother. Deborah sat by her bed and looked at the pile of pillows covered with a lace bedspread. She couldn't gather her thoughts. She had to somehow continue living. But how? Deborah had just finished school, but now there could be no talk of further education. She had to find a job. "Deborah, are you home?" Connor, Deborah's former classmate, stood in the doorway. He had been asking her to marry him since childhood, but the girl only laughed at the snub-nosed, stunted beau. "Where else could I be?" she sighed. "I'm sitting here thinking about where to go now." "I came just for that. I heard my mother say they need a postal worker. Aunt Vera got sick and went to her son, and now there is no one to do her job. Go to the post office. Maybe they'll take you." Deborah immediately ran to the nearest post office and by evening was hired as a new mail carrier. The job was hard. The bag was tearing her shoulder and her legs were giving out by evening, but the girl didn't give up. Although this job brought her just a small income, it was her own earnings. There at the post office, Deborah met Mick. The polite and well-managed guy once offered to help the fragile girl with her huge mail bag. They struck up a conversation, and since then, Mick began to visit the post office more and more often. He was 10 years older than young Deborah, but even though he was already a fairly grown-up person, he often referred to his mother's opinion in conversation. Deborah should have realised that she was dealing with a typical mama's boy, but the girl was inexperienced, and it seemed to her that if she had a mother, she would certainly listen to her opinion too. On the day when Mick decided to introduce Deborah to his family, the girl felt like she was on cloud nine. Mick proposed to her, and she, an orphan, would soon become a member of a worthy family. Lonely and inexperienced, Deborah thought that her life would be just as happy and carefree as when her beloved grandmother was alive. Mick's parents accepted her quite warmly, but the day before they had a serious conversation with their son, trying to convince him not to marry a poor girl, especially an orphan. Alas, their son was stubborn for almost the first time in his life, and they gave up. At the meeting, Mick's parents smiled sweetly at Deborah, and she had no idea of their real attitude towards her. Soon the young couple got married, and just a month later, the newlyweds announced to their parents that they were expecting a baby. By that time, Deborah had resigned from her job. Mick's parents insisted that she should not work as a mail carrier. They were ashamed before their acquaintances that their daughter-in-law was engaged in such an unprestigious job. On the day when Deborah was told during an ultrasound that she would have a boy, Mick was the happiest person in the world. He brought his wife a huge bouquet, and his mother gave the bride a gold ring. "This is our gratitude to you for our future grandson. My husband and I always dreamed of a boy as smart as our Mick. Look how cute he was." Eleanor handed her daughter-in-law childhood photos of her son. "It is necessary that the baby looks like Mick. He will be such a cute child." It was somehow strange. According to Eleanor's words, it turned out that Deborah could somehow influence the appearance and mental abilities of the future child. Moreover, it sounded as if Mick's parents really did not want the baby to resemble Deborah in any way. On the eve of the birth, Deborah dreamed of her grandmother. For some reason, she was crying and shaking her head, looking at her granddaughter. Deborah woke up with some incomprehensible feeling of anxiety. A couple of hours later, the contractions began, and she no longer had time to think about the meaning of this dream. At first, everything was going well in the hospital, and the doctor reassured Deborah that childbirth preparation was going as planned. But then everything suddenly changed. A nurse barged into the pre-delivery room and demanded that Mick leave. "She's going for a C-section. You have nothing to do here," she told the shocked guy. "What C-section? We're having a natural birth." There were no indications for surgery anymore. Mick tried to argue. "How do you know?" the nurse began to shout. "The doctor ordered her to be urgently prepared for surgery. That means he has some new information and indications for surgery." At that moment, the doctor delivering the baby rushed into the ward with a frightened face. "Why isn't she ready yet? Urgently, to the operating room," he said. Mick and Deborah tried to prove something, but no one listened to them. Deborah was taken away, and the guy couldn't sit still, not understanding what could have happened. He walked back and forth in the corridor, all the time listening to the sounds from the operating room. And, for a moment, he even heard the cry of a baby. "My son was born," flashed through his mind, his heart beating happily, and he breathed a sigh of relief. "I'm a father." Mick was ready to run to Deborah and the baby, but the doctor who operated on Deborah came out to him. "I'm very sorry. Your child was stillborn," he said dryly. Mick couldn't believe his ears. "You probably got something mixed up. I heard a baby cry," he said. "That baby was born to another woman in the neighbouring operating room. You heard the cry of someone else's baby," the doctor replied, in a tone that brooked no objections. "Your wife will soon come to her senses, and you will need to talk to her to avoid any hysterics. She's young. You'll have more children." Deborah couldn't believe what Mick told her. She couldn't believe that her little baby, who had been tossing and turning in her belly and kicking with tiny legs just yesterday, her beloved, long-awaited son, had left forever. She didn't believe it, even when they brought out the lifeless body of the newborn, and she refused to even look at him. Mick himself took and buried his son. He would come to the little grave and cry for hours. Deborah began to distance herself from her husband further and further. She stubbornly insisted that her son was alive and made Mick more and more angry with her words. The grandmother came to her granddaughter in a dream again and again, looking at her and crying, but for some reason she couldn't say anything to her, as if she didn't have the strength. Deborah felt that something was going very wrong in her life, but she couldn't understand what exactly was wrong and what she could do to fix it. And her mother-in-law constantly turned Mick against her, convincing him that there would be no use from Deborah. Look at her. Not only did she give birth to a dead child, she also lost her mind. She keeps insisting that her son is alive. She never goes to her son's grave. You need to divorce her, son, otherwise we'll all go crazy here. And after 6 months, the young couple divorced. Deborah went back to her village and settled in her old grandmother's house. She got a job at the post office again and lived as a recluse. More and more often, she began to collect herbs, as her grandmother once did. She started helping people, like her grandmother used to do in the old days. In her spare time, Deborah wandered through the forest, collecting medicinal plants and listening to the singing of birds. And at night, she dreamed more and more often of a red-haired and blue-eyed boy, just like herself. It was strange that, with each passing day in her dreams, he became more and more grown up. At first he was a child who had just learned to walk. Then he ran to her in his sleep, and after 2 years he was already a very independent boy. "Billy," Deborah whispered in her sleep, "my son, how can I find you?" Deborah didn't tell anyone about her dreams, but sometimes she felt like she was going crazy. But she eagerly awaited night after night to see her child again, as if he were real. She held him in her arms, stroked his unruly curls, sang him songs in her sleep, and looked at his smiling face. Deborah was afraid to tell even Connor about these dreams. He had been her friend all her life. He had been there for her constantly since she returned to the village, trying to make her happy in any way he could. But Deborah still wouldn't let him get close to her. She had had enough of the treacherous betrayal she had experienced with Mick. Connor didn't push himself on her. He was just there and offered a helping hand to the lonely woman when she needed it. Grandma didn't come to Deborah's dream anymore, as if she had taken her grandson by the hand and brought him into Deborah's dreams and stopped bothering her granddaughter. But one night, the grandmother came back to Deborah in her sleep. She was just like in life. This time she wasn't crying. Deborah clearly saw that the old woman's face was anxious, and she wanted to say something. The grandmother tried to call her granddaughter, took her hand in her sleep, and led her to the road. Deborah woke up and couldn't understand what her grandmother wanted from her and where she was calling her to. The dream repeated itself the next night, but this time Deborah was prepared. "What do you want to tell me?" Deborah whispered in her sleep. "I want to hear you. Tell me." "Your son is alive," Grandma suddenly spoke to her. "You saw him in your dream, and you know what he looks like. He needs to be found urgently, otherwise you will never be able to see him again. I will show you the place where he lives." Deborah felt like she was flying, just like in her childhood dreams. She saw a familiar forest and beyond it a large mansion. Although she had never been there, Deborah knew that there was a city beyond the forest. The mansion was very luxurious, with a huge garden that had fountains, shady alleys and green lawns. When Deborah woke up, she was in a daze for a long time. She couldn't stop thinking about her dream, which had felt so real. She decided to go on a trip and see the mysterious mansion with her own eyes. At first, the road through the forest was familiar to her. She had walked here many times in her childhood and youth with her grandmother, and later searching for rare healing herbs when she started to treat people herself. Then came unfamiliar places, swampy and impassable areas. Deborah was already thinking of abandoning this foolish idea and returning home before it got dark. But suddenly, the forest abruptly became brighter and better maintained. Soon, through the trees, she could see the cottage of a prestigious country village. Deborah came out to the edge and stopped dead in her tracks. The house from her dream was right in front of her. She couldn't mistake it for any other. She saw its image so clearly. On the lawn in front of the house, a 3-year-old boy was misbehaving, judging by the reproaches of an elderly woman who appeared to be his nanny. Deborah approached closer. The rays of the setting sun shone directly into her eyes, making it difficult to see the boy's face. She tried, but couldn't tell if he looked like the boy from her dream. "Billy!" The breathless nanny stopped chasing him and decided to sit on a bench. "Billy, your father will scold us for being late again. Let's go home, please." The boy ran away with a scream and immediately collided with Deborah, who was standing there in shock. She couldn't believe her eyes. This was her little Billy, the same boy she had been seeing in her dreams for more than 2 years. "Wait, don't run away." Deborah stopped the boy. "I saw a kitten under the bush somewhere. Let's look for it together." She took the boy by the hand and led him to the bush, while signalling to the nanny. The nanny approached, thanked Deborah, picked up the boy and was about to leave for the house. "Wait, do you happen to know if they're looking for a maid in this house? I could clean or cook. I'm good at many things." Deborah was looking for a way to keep the woman talking and engage her in conversation. "I'm sorry, but no, they won't be hiring anyone. The owners are moving to Spain soon, and the house will either be closed or sold." The talkative woman was happy to discuss the owner's business. "Hey, little one, you'll soon become a real Spanish macho." Deborah joked with the child. "Do you know who toreadors are? They're the bravest, not afraid of big bulls. Are you brave too?" "I'm the bravest," the little boy declared confidently. "And how old are you?" "It's almost my birthday, and my dad promised to give me a puppy." The little one shared his excitement with her. "Yes, his birthday is next Friday," the nanny confirmed. "Celebrate and then go to Spain," she said to the boy. Deborah listened and understood that her son would have turned 3 years old on the same Friday. How was it possible that a child born on the same day as her deceased son could be in front of her by chance? "Well, I wish you a good journey and a happy birthday." Deborah stroked the child's head, unnoticeably taking a small strand of hair from his head. It was getting dark fast, and she didn't go back through the woods. The woman went out on the highway and caught a hitchhiking car. Now Deborah couldn't waste a minute. Soon, very soon, they would take Billy to Europe forever. That's what her grandmother warned her about in the dream. She urgently needed to do a DNA test and finally understand if this was her child or if she had gone crazy. Connor was still awake when Deborah burst into his house with burning eyes, holding a small bundle in her fist. "Connor, I need your help. I urgently need to find a laboratory to mail a DNA test. I can't tell you why, otherwise you'll think I've gone crazy." In the morning, he drove her to the city with the coveted strand of hair, which now held so much in her life and the life of one little boy. Deborah was terrified that she wouldn't get the result before Billy left for Spain. But 4 days later the DNA test result was ready, and she held the coveted document in her hands. "Connor, you won't believe what I have. Look, it says here that the degree of relationship between me and Billy is 99%. "Which Billy?" Connor was puzzled. "Deborah, what are you talking about?" Finally, Deborah told Connor everything that had been happening to her lately. He knew, of course, that she had lost her child, but he couldn't expect Deborah to still consider him alive. Moreover, she was still looking for him. And the fact that she found her son alive in someone else's family was more like the delirium of a madwoman. However, the document was real, official. There's no doubt about it. But how? How did she find him? "Are you sure you're not a witch?" Connor could not find explanations for everything that was happening. "Connor, it doesn't matter now. My Billy will be taken abroad any minute now, and I will lose him forever. Okay, we must go to these people right now and solve everything on the spot." When they arrived at the house to pick up Billy, they were initially taken for fraudsters. And when Deborah caused scandals, saying that she wouldn't leave without her son, they even called the police. She showed them a document stating that she was the mother of a certain child. But where was the evidence that it was indeed Billy, and that it was his biomaterial that was tested? A real commotion broke out. Deborah filed a police report against Billy's parents and the doctors at the maternity hospital. They filed statements against her and tried to close the case as quickly as possible, so they could go to Spain as planned. But Deborah clung to their family with an iron grip. Now she was 100% sure that he was her child, and she wouldn't let him go, even at the cost of her own life. To detach from the crazy woman and close the case as soon as possible, it was decided to do repeat tests. What a surprise it was when this test also indicated that the boy was indeed Deborah's son. Now there was no question of taking him abroad, and the police began to investigate why Billy had been living in someone else's family all these years. It even came to the exhumation of the body of the baby that was buried as Deborah's son 3 years ago. Mick, who had already forgotten about his ex-wife but still visited their son's grave, was in complete shock when it turned out that the second child was actually the child of the family in which Billy was raised. Everyone understood that the substitution had occurred during childbirth. The doctor who delivered both women was detained, and he admitted that the wife of a very prominent deputy and businessman in their area had actually been brought to their maternity hospital 3 years ago. The family planned to give birth at the best capital clinic, but labour began prematurely and the doctor had to perform a caesarean section. However, they couldn't save the baby, who was stillborn. "You see, We were terrified. They were a very influential family. They could have thought that we were responsible for the death of the baby. They would have dragged us through the courts, or maybe even worse. I panicked. I decided to perform a cesarean on another woman and give her baby to these people. It was terrible, but I didn't even realize what I was doing at that moment. And then it was even scarier to confess to my actions. It was a terrible confession. People couldn't believe that a doctor would stoop to such a low. But now they at least understood how such confusion with the babies could have occurred. Deborah took Billy. His adoptive parents had to come to terms with the loss, and the child had to get to know his biological mother and get used to her. The doctor and nurse were sentenced. The maternity hospital began strict checks, as a result of which a number of violations were revealed, although not as egregious. It was difficult for many at that time, but Deborah was happy for the first time in years. The boy quickly got used to her. He had been raised exclusively by nannies since childhood, who, moreover, were often changed over these 3 years because of the whimsical character of the mistress of the house, Paula. Therefore, when a new mother appeared in his life, who spent all her spare time with him, sang him lullabies at night, walked with him holding hands, he easily became attached to her. Billy's previous family still went to Spain as planned, taking promises from Deborah to send them photos of their son, videos of him, and to have video communication at least once a week. In fact, they were good people, and suffered no less than Deborah in this situation. A year later, Paula successfully carried and gave birth to a baby girl under the vigilant supervision of doctors. Deborah was glad for her. She was grateful to fate and her late grandmother, who kept her promise and did not leave her without her patronage. And even from the afterlife, she helped to return her son. And Deborah was also grateful to Connor for being the only one in this whole world who always supported her and helped her to get Billy back. Deborah eventually married him. And one night, her grandmother appeared to her again in a dream. She showed Deborah a tiny girl sitting on the lawn in front of their house among the daisies and smiling. The next day, Deborah found out that she was expecting a baby. "We will have a girl," she confidently told her husband, "and we will name her in honor of my grandmother." However, this is an entirely different story. "Well, I don't have time, I'm late for work," said the young man, kissing his mother on the cheek goodbye. "Take the umbrella, son, it's raining heavily outside," Mrs. Taylor said, and shook her head reproachfully. She looked out the window and watched her son, who had matured into a handsome man. Sighing sadly, the woman began to rush about in the kitchen, trying to cook something delicious for Kevin's arrival from work. The thought of setting her son up with Regina was like a splinter in Mrs. Taylor's mind. She and Regina's mother had been friends for a long time, and from the moment their children started school, they had dreamed of becoming related by marriage. Regina's family was well-to-do, and Mrs. Taylor wanted her son to become a member of that family and live in wealth and luxury. She had divorced Kelvin's father long ago, being unable to tolerate his endless cheating and lying. Left alone with her baby son, the woman did not give up and gave him everything he needed, having 2 or even 3 jobs at a time. During the day, she taught language and literature in high school, and in the evenings, she gave extra lessons at home. So, knowing how complicated and unfair life can be, Mrs. Taylor tried to protect her son from rash decisions in arranging his personal life. But all his mother's efforts about Regina irritated Kelvin. He had nothing serious with her, only a couple of dates and a kiss near the front door. Kelvin worked as a manager at a large company, and in general he liked his job very much. A friendly staff, frequent corporate parties, loyal attitude of the management were a nice bonus to his good salary. The guy grew up without a father and therefore knew the value of money and financial independence. This morning's conversation with his mother left an unpleasant residue in Kelvin's soul because he had heard about this Regina many times before. What's so unusual about her? A pretty girl, a nice face, a slender figure, nothing special. So what if her parents were businessmen? Thought the man to himself, carefully avoiding the puddles. It was early spring, which, as if longing for the gone winter, was abundantly pouring rain on the ground. Although Kelvin walked under an umbrella, his pants and shoes were soaked, so when he approached the business centre, where the office of their firm was located, the man exhaled lightly. Presenting the pass to the security guard, Kelvin went up to the second floor. As he was a little late after the conversation with his mother, work was already in full swing in the office, and the noise of printers, fax machines and other equipment could be heard. Greeting his colleagues softly, Kelvin took his seat and began to look through client requests. Suddenly, someone quietly touched him by the elbow. He turned his head in surprise and saw a pretty young girl whose face was unfamiliar to him. "Excuse me, this is my first day on the job and my printer is jamming the paper. Could you please help me?" said the stranger, lowering her eyes guiltily. Her cheeks were flushed, making her even more attractive. "I'm not really an expert in this kind of business, but for such beauty I can make an exception," replied Kelvin with a smile, and went to the table where the new employee was working. He fixed the problem rather quickly, which earned the girl's approving glance. "Well now, I owe you one. How can I compensate for the loss of your time and effort?" jokingly asked the new employee, fixing the naughty bangs falling over her eyes. "If you tell me your name and treat me to something delicious at lunchtime, then I'll consider it the best reward for my work." Playing along with the joking tone of the girl, replied Kelvin. "Okay, my name is Nancy," laughed the girl, and went to her workplace. Until the lunchtime, Kelvin and Nancy were timidly exchanging glances, hiding embarrassed smiles behind their monitor screens. Finally, the hands of the clock approached the cherished number, and with a sense of accomplishment, the office staff headed off to lunch at a cosy coffee shop around the corner. "Here I am, as promised, returning the favour," Nancy said cheerfully, and after putting coffee and cheesecake on the table, she sat down near Kelvin. "Thank you very much," Kelvin replied, and a conversation ensued between the two young people. It turned out that Nancy was hired as a manager with a 1-month probationary period, and therefore she felt a certain nervousness. The second half of the workday passed without incident, and Nancy was finally able to catch her breath. She really needed this job, so she made a maximum effort to quickly get into all the professional intricacies and secrets. When the working day came to an end, Kelvin offered to escort Nancy home. "Nancy, let's go to the movies or a cafe tomorrow," suggested Kelvin, and as if by chance, while walking, he touched Nancy's hand. "Yes, I would love to, but tomorrow is my day off. I'll be with my little brother all day," she explained confusedly. "Well, that's not a problem. Let's go together. And then we can go to the rides. Come on, say yes. There's nothing to think about." "All right, then come pick me up tomorrow at 3. Mitchell and I will be glad," replied Nancy with a smile. Kelvin spent the next half of the day in agonizing suspense, now and then glancing at the hands of the clock, which seemed to have deliberately slowed down. Mrs. Taylor, seeing her son's mood, asked if he was going on a date. "Mum, you've just read my thoughts," smiled Kelvin, trying to cope with his excitement. "Well, finally, how happy I am for you and Regina. Well done, son. It was long overdue to ask a girl out on a date." "Mum, who had told you that I was going out with Regina? I thought you heard me, but you're up to it again," said Kelvin irritably, and left slamming the door. Shocked by this news, Mrs. Taylor could not come to her senses for a long time. Meanwhile, Kelvin had already rushed at full speed to Nancy's house. The girl, as agreed, came out exactly at 3 o'clock, holding the hand of her brother Mitchell, who looked about 6 years old. With the look of a circus magician, Kelvin took the movie tickets out of his pocket and handed them to his charming companion and her brother. The evening went splendidly. Mitchell had never been to a movie before and got many unforgettable emotions, crunching popcorn with a bottle of sweet soda in his hand. Then there were rides and merry-go-rounds and other entertainment. The joyful laughter of Nancy and Mitchell caused a rush of tenderness and love in Kelvin's heart. At the end of the day, the tired but happy trio went home. From his conversation with Nancy, Kelvin found out that she and Mitchell were orphans and had different fathers. Nancy did not know her father, and her mother disliked talking about the mistakes of her youth. Mitchell's father was a district police officer who had died during the arrest of a very dangerous criminal. At that time, Nancy's mother was pregnant. Perhaps the death of her husband, or maybe a natural predisposition, caused her death from complications caused by difficult childbirth. At first, Nancy and Mitchell were looked after by her aunt, but she didn't care much for the children, so as soon as Nancy reached the age where she could work, the heartless woman kicked her and Mitchell out the door. After that memorable evening spent together, Nancy and Kelvin began to see each other every day, and not only within the walls of the office. Over time, their relationship grew into a stormy romance, which was impossible to hide from others. Their co-workers considered them a couple, behind the scenes calling them newlyweds. Of course, in a tight-knit team it is hard to hide anything, so soon everyone in the office knew that Nancy was a poor orphan who had nothing behind her soul. And one day, Regina saw Kelvin and Nancy walking from work and holding hands. Envy and anger instantly arose in the girl's heart. She immediately told Kelvin's mother, whom she already considered her future mother-in-law, about what she had seen. "I'll deal with him, honey, you can be sure of that," Mrs. Taylor assured the girl. That same evening, she and Kelvin had an unpleasant conversation. "Son, I've been doing some research on your new girlfriend. I don't know why you need that beggar girl. No home, no family. And with Regina you'll have a great time. And her parents like you. They'll help you move up the career ladder." "Mum, I love Nancy and that's it. And besides, I've already proposed to her," said Kelvin, in a tone that could not tolerate objections. Mrs. Taylor involuntarily admired her son, who in his angry determination was so similar to his father in his youth. But neither Regina's tears nor his mother's pleas had any effect on Kelvin. The wedding day was inexorably approaching. Soon, Nancy and Kelvin were to become husband and wife. The young people decided not to have a big wedding, limiting themselves to a simple marriage registration. Since Nancy was an orphan, she had only her brother Mitchell at the ceremony, but Kelvin came with his friends, including Regina's brother. After the rings were exchanged, the newlyweds went outside where everyone began to congratulate Kelvin, ignoring Nancy, who was modestly standing on the sidelines and felt out of place. Most of Kelvin's friends were children of wealthy parents, and in their eyes this gave them the right to look down on Nancy. Suddenly, a slightly tipsy Regina's brother approached the newlyweds, and after handing the bouquet to Nancy, led Kelvin away. "Well, buddy, you got yourself into a mess. How could you marry this ragamuffin? Did you want some extreme? That's your business. But you were not nice to my sister. She thought she was your bride." "I fell in love with Nancy and I can't help it," Kelvin replied, making excuses. "What can your beggar girl offer you but love? My father was going to give you a new car, and now you're going to carry this beggar on your shoulders instead. I'm very disappointed in you, Kelvin." Kelvin said nothing to this, and soon Nancy came up to him and said quietly, "I have heard everything. It's unpleasant and mean. They're bad-mouthing me, and you're standing there in silence. What are you making up? He's just my friend from school, and he's drunk as well, answered Kelvin angrily. But I see that you're ashamed of me. You hide your eyes in front of your rich friends. You haven't introduced me to your mother yet. Tell me, what have I and my brother done wrong to all them? You know what, Nancy? Since we're having this conversation, let's break up. I'm sorry, but I suddenly realized it was for the best, said Kelvin, who had been more and more influenced by friends, co-workers, and his mother lately. Oh, Kelvin, what a shame. We've only just got married. It's not a big deal. We'll divorce in a week or a month, indifferently replied Kelvin and walked away, leaving a weeping Nancy in the middle of the street. They were divorced in 5 days. Regina was over the moon about it. Now that her rival was out of the way, the cunning girl played on the naive man's feelings and got his heart in her hands again. Of course, Kelvin did not love her, but some feelings were still in him, and it was enough for Regina to gratify her self-esteem. Soon they were married, to the great pleasure of Kelvin's mother. Nancy, after the disgrace of the wedding and the subsequent divorce, resigned from the company so as not to see the man who had broken her heart. Mrs. Taylor was now at peace with her son. It seemed to her that with Regina he would find happiness and prosperity. But the vengeful daughter-in-law thought a little differently. She could not forgive Kelvin the fact that he neglected her by marrying a destitute orphan, and she used to mock and tease her husband. A year passed imperceptibly. Kelvin, just like before, was working as a manager and living with Regina. Her successful parents at every opportunity reminded him that he was a pauper who could not afford to buy a house and support a family. Finding himself in Nancy's shoes, Kelvin understood what it was like and what the orphan girl had gone through, but the past was irretrievable, and the man tried not to reopen old wounds. One morning, coming to work, Kelvin saw a luxury car at the entrance to the business centre. The new manager of the company, who was just appointed yesterday, has arrived, the security guard said confidently. An intrigued Kelvin went up to the floor, opened the office door, and became shocked to see Nancy giving instructions to his colleagues. The girl wore a strict pantsuit of English wool and amazing high-heeled shoes. Of course, she recognized Kelvin, nodding at his greeting. The guy couldn't have known that right after their divorce, Nancy was found by her real father, who didn't know he had a daughter. The truth was discovered by chance when he saw a familiar name in the list of dismissed employees of the company he owned. Once he started with petty trade, but over time, thanks to perseverance and innate business acumen, he became a millionaire. After making inquiries about Nancy, Mr. Jackson realized that it was his daughter, and the DNA test done afterward only confirmed his assumption. In need of a reliable leader for his company, he offered his daughter to lead it. Nancy agreed, and after training, took a high position in the company, where she was once a probationary manager. Communication with Kelvin was openly avoided by Nancy, but when he ambushed her outside her car, she couldn't stand it. "Kelvin, it's over between us. You chased 2 rabbits and didn't catch either one. Forget about me if you don't want to be fired. I have a boyfriend who loves and appreciates me for who I am. I hope that from now on we will not return to this kind of conversation. Goodbye." Kelvin, feeling humiliated, looked after the departing car. Different feelings struggled in his soul. He understood that having made the wrong choice in the past, he had a corresponding result in the present. The man blamed no one. He simply walked down the street, wiping away the tears in the corner of his eyes. Remorse, though late, still touched Kelvin's heart. A month later, he divorced Regina and went to live in another city. There, he decided to start over. But that's another story. Mrs. Wilson disliked her daughter-in-law Lauren from the very beginning. The woman believed that the daughter of an ordinary teacher was no match for her son, a promising young man working as a deputy director of a developing company. She kept telling Mark that he had chosen an unsuitable bride and asked him to leave her before it would be too late. But Mark did not listen to his mother's admonitions. He married the girl he loved, in spite of all protests and prohibitions. His mother was angry for some time. She even stopped talking to her son for a while. But then she pretended to accept his wife, though at every opportunity she tried to insert her motherly opinion. In conversations with her son, the woman not only reproached Lauren for her inexperience and inability to keep house, but also considered her frivolous and too often smiling at other men. However, Mark did not believe his mother's words. He trusted his wife, loved her, and could not even imagine that she would suddenly decide to cheat on him. One day, Lauren came back from her mother and sat down next to Mark with a sad expression on her face. "Is something wrong?" he said worriedly. "You see, Mum was supposed to go to the resort with Melanie, but her boss didn't let her go from work. My sister was so looking forward to this trip, so dreamed of the sea, and now," Lauren sighed, "Mum asked me to go with my sister. But your opinion is critical to me. What do you think about it?" "Well, you have scared me," exhaled Mark with relief. "Of course, go. It will be useful for you too, to get some sea air." Lauren joyfully hugged and kissed her husband. She said she would miss him very much, and once again thought to herself how lucky she was to have him. A week later, Lauren left with her younger sister to rest, and Mark immediately began to miss his wife. The apartment became too empty without her. It seemed that he lost a part of himself. Mark's mother often called him, making all sorts of ugly hints. "Why don't you visit her, Mother? Maybe she needs help. Or maybe you're afraid that you'll come to them and her sister will open the door for you. I've lived enough in the world, and I wouldn't be surprised if your Lauren went on vacation with a man, perhaps even with her boss." Mark was angry at his mother for such talk, threatened to stop communicating with her if she would not stop insulting his wife. But doubts still settled in his soul. One day Mrs. Wilson sent her son a picture that Lauren had posted on her social networking page. "Take a close look at your wifey." Mark was just at work, so he caught a glimpse of the smiling Lauren and was about to put his phone away when suddenly he noticed something that made his smile disappear. He saw the photographer's shadow. The clear male silhouette meant only one thing. It was not Lauren's sister who took the picture, but a man. Mark hardly waited until evening, knowing that Lauren would call as usual. When the call rang, he flinched, terrified to hear the truth that she could crush him. "Honey, I have news for you," shouted Lauren joyfully. "I'm pregnant." "Who took that last picture?" asked Mark dryly, not paying any attention to his wife's words. Lauren stopped speaking in unpleasant surprise, not understanding why her husband had such a strange reaction. Meanwhile, Mark was no longer even sure that Lauren's child was from him. "Melanie, of course," Lauren replied confidently in the end. "Really?" "Yes, my mother was right, you sneaky liar. Forget your way here, and I'll send your things to your mother's by mail," shouted Mark, and turned off the phone. Lauren did not understand what had happened to her husband. She was hurt and offended, but she tried to hold back her tears so as not to upset her sister. When Melanie fell asleep, the woman stepped out onto the embankment and let her tears well up. She waited for her husband to call to apologize, but the phone was silent. Lauren's head was spinning, and tears rolled like large hailstones from her eyes. The woman could not believe that all this had happened to her. When she came back from the resort, she tried to talk to her husband, but he made it clear that he did not want anything to do with her. Thinking that Mark was afraid of the responsibility of the baby and decided to get rid of them in this unsophisticated way, Lauren chose to back off. She determined that in any case she would give birth and raise the child herself and do everything to ensure that he did not need anything. A year and a half passed. Lauren was walking in the park with her son, who was quietly dozing in his baby stroller. The woman thought about Mark again. During all this time, her ex-husband had never even called to ask about the baby. She herself had forgiven him long ago, because despite the unhappy ending to their story, they also had beautiful moments. She was distracted from her sad thoughts by a question from a strange man. "Excuse me, may I take your picture? I can't go on living in peace if I don't capture such beauty. My name is Robert, by the way." "Lauren," the woman replied, embarrassed, and smiled. After divorcing his wife, Mark's life did not work out. At work, he began to poorly cope with his duties, and finally he was demoted, explaining that he should not count on more. Mark understood that he would never be the same after his wife's betrayal. At first, he withdrew into himself, and then he began to change women one after another, until his mother found him what she thought was the right match for him. He had been dating with Patricia for several months, and he considered her suitable for him, but still she did not seem genuine to him, in contrast to his ex-wife. One day Mrs. Wilson told her son that she managed to get tickets to a resort at a good discount, and she offered Mark to go with Patricia to rest. The mother was persistent, and Mark agreed, sadly remembering that it was the resort where Lauren had cheated on him with another man. 2 weeks later, Mark and Patricia were walking along the waterfront and took pictures as a memento. For some reason, the man decided to take a photo in the exact spot where Lauren was standing at a time. Patricia snapped a picture and handed Mark the photo, but to his surprise, he saw the same man's shadow in the photo once again. Mark looked up and saw a huge statue of the man behind Patricia. Instantly realizing what a terrible mistake he had made, Mark told Patricia on the same day that he did not really want to be with her. Leaving her alone on vacation, he hurried home. Back in the city, he berated himself for his measures and betrayal to the woman he had loved. He realized that he himself had ruined his happy life and broken the fate of not only his wife, but also his child. His head was bursting with thoughts, and most importantly, he did not know where to look for Lauren now. He decided to go to her mother's home to find out his ex-wife's address, but Lauren opened the door herself. "Lauren, I'm sorry. I know it was the statue's shadow, not the man's. I've been such a fool," whispered Mark. "I know," replied Lauren, "but would it make a difference?" At that moment, 2 boys, ages 5 and 3, ran out into the hallway. Lauren asked Robert to keep an eye on the children, and she went out to the staircase, shutting the door behind her. Already realizing that he had come too late, Mark asked sadly, "Are you happy?" "Very happy. Robert is a great husband and his mother is a wonderful woman who loves me and the children very much. We have a happy family." "What about me? What about my son?" Lauren grinned and reminded her ex-husband that he hadn't even thought of his son in all that time, and Robert had become a real father to him, and the boy knew no other. "You will hurt him the way you once hurt me. Don't do this, Mark, for the sake of the child, please." Mark lowered his head. At that moment, the door opened ajar, and Lauren's mother looked out onto the set. "Honey, everything's ready. Let's go set the table," said the woman affectionately. "Yes, I'm coming," Lauren responded warmly and turned to Mark. "Thanks, but we don't need anything," she said dryly toward her ex-husband and slammed the door in his face like he was some annoying salesman. Lauren was really happy. She was in love with Robert and he loved her. His mother never interfered in their relationship, respecting and accepting her son's choices. Although Robert and Lauren had a mutual son, Robert loved the elder son no less. He kept repeating that the father was not the only one who gave birth, but the one who raised the boy into a real man by becoming a father and a best friend. On the other hand, Mark was left with a broken heart. He knew he had made a mistake for which he would have to pay for the rest of his life, but he did not realize that it was he himself who had allowed his mother to sow doubt in his heart, and it gave him bitter fruit. Mark heard what Lauren wanted to tell him. Once he had already betrayed her and his child, whom he had so easily abandoned, so he had no right to intrude into their lives now. Mark was heartbroken that somewhere out there, behind a closed door, his little son, whose name he did not even know, was running around, but he would never dare to destroy his happy world. Herman was a fairly well-known businessman in the city. Despite his wealth, he remained a kind, compassionate man, and, as they say, absolutely simple. He was not tempted by foie gras and black caviar with truffles. He liked usual food, like his mother used to cook for him in his childhood, and no molecular cuisine was even close to it. However, his fiancée Christine had different tastes. Ragout, meat pie? No, she would like a fresh croissant, and certainly in France, watching the Eiffel Tower. Herman's relatives and friends, knowing his lifestyle and character, sincerely could not understand how he could get involved with such a girl. But love is evil. You never know who you will fall in love with. Christine was a very attractive girl. Her beautiful figure and milk chocolate-coloured skin made her attractive to any man. And, as Christine herself believed, her beauty had no equal after she had corrected her lips and cheekbones with a plastic surgery. The girl had long, thick straw-coloured hair, and her huge blue eyes looked so sincere and naive that Herman had no chance against her. Moreover, Christine was extremely charming and knew how to use her attractiveness. She was lively and, importantly, always laughed at Herman's jokes at the right time. She showed extreme interest in the business and hobbies of her man, and took care of him after a hard day. And, in bed, she demonstrated miracles. So shortly after they met, Herman and Christine were already living together in his house. The 3-story house had a huge territory with a fruit garden, a swimming pool, and a gazebo with a barbecue area. Therefore, in addition to the owner and his bride, there were often workers in the house. Sometimes the services of a gardener were necessary, sometimes a plumber. Herman always hired people responsibly. After all, he invited them under his roof. Christine was less interested in household matters than in her manicure, so she didn't interfere. But one day, the businessman hired a woman with a criminal past. Mary was a quiet, kind woman, about 45 years old. She came to him to ask for a position as a cleaner. She heard of the vacancy from her previous employer, who had left with his family for the capital city, and now Mary was looking for a new job. But few people wanted to hire a woman with a criminal record. So, the job at Herman's house was essentially necessary for her. Moreover, it promised not only a good salary, but also food and a room. Looking at the woman sitting modestly in front of him, Herman was amazed. It was impossible to recognize the former inmate in Mary. She was neat, with a kind smile and a sad look. "How did you end up in prison?" Herman asked directly. The woman didn't even think of getting offended or lying, and answered with a sad smile that she was imprisoned because of love. "I was stupid, fell in love with the wrong person, and I'm still paying for it." "I don't recall such an article in the criminal code," Herman smirked. "Yeah, I had another article." The woman shook her head and told her employer her story. It turned out that Mary had a man named Jerry. He was good, played the guitar, he was very handy and could do everything around the house. But over time, the woman began to notice that Jerry was changing for the worse. He became twitchy, irritable. He could disappear without explanation for a couple of days and then reappear at the doorstep as if nothing had happened and ask for forgiveness. And then the irreparable happened, which divided Mary's life into before and after. Men in uniform appeared at the door of her apartment, and illegal substances were found in her things. Of course, she didn't even know they were there, but she understood perfectly well where this destroyer of human lives came from in her things. As soon as she arrived at the police station, she immediately said that there had been a terrible mistake, but no one believed her. And then everything was like a nightmare. Court, prison, and gloominess. It was even worse to be stabbed in the back by her ex-boyfriend. He, without blinking an eye, provided evidence against Mary. He began to tell tales about how she sold all this stuff. "Did you not notice before that he was a rotten person?" Herman sincerely asked in response to the woman's story. "You should have run away from him." "Love is blind." Mary smiled so kindly that it touched the man. "I sincerely loved him. I did not expect betrayal." The man felt sorry for the woman. Her story had touched him. He loved justice, believed in the law of karma, and believed that one should always act according to conscience. It was no wonder he ran an honest business. Therefore, such injustice towards Mary greatly upset him. "Why don't you apply for rehabilitation?" the man insisted. "I was immediately warned in prison. Just try to file a complaint against someone, and you will be charged again under the same article, but for a longer period of time. So I decided it would be better to forget everything like a bad dream. But after serving time, my nightmare didn't end. People don't want to hire me for work, and they don't want to have anything to do with me." In the end, kind-hearted Herman, unlike many others, believed the woman. Moreover, he believed that people should be given a second chance. So, the wealthy businessman decided to hire the former prisoner for work and even let her live in his house. Everything would have been good But as soon as his fiancée Christine found out that there would be a jailbird in the same house with her, she fell into hysterics. "How is that possible?" she complained to Herman, theatrically wringing her hands and occasionally breaking into a shrill scream. "Do you want me to live here with a real criminal? A convict? You don't value me at all. What if she cuts my throat at night? Huh? What if she steals something? Who knows what ex-convicts are capable of? Or what kind of friends she has left in the prison? What she learned there? Fire her, Herman, before it gets worse." But Herman could not fire the woman he believed in, and whose destiny was already difficult enough. Besides, there was no reason to fire her. "Don't waste your breath, Christine," Herman objected wearily to his hysterical fiancée. "Mary is doing her job perfectly. There's no dust in the house. Everything is clean. All the clothes are in order. Nobody else complains about her. It's just you who are driving me crazy. And you can't even see her at all. She's always busy with work. You should take her as an example, because you're getting all sorts of nonsense in your head out of boredom. Find something to do." After such words and accusations, Christine harboured even more resentment. If she couldn't vent her anger on her potential husband, then on the maid with such a grim past, why not? The woman started small. She would break something or spill a drink right on the carpet in front of Mary. "Oh, I'm so clumsy." She looked at the cleaning lady with her childishly naive eyes, fluttering her eyelashes like a fan. "I'm sorry. Just clean this up properly. Make sure there are no traces on the carpet." Saying this, Christine smiled cunningly and maliciously. The grin of a hyena did not fit her beautiful face at all. It's a pity she didn't risk showing this side of her nature to her fiancé. Then Christine had gone so far as to ruin her own things. Blouses, dresses and skirts. Of course, she blamed Mary for everything. The woman, in her opinion, just didn't know how to handle expensive things properly. "Just look, Herman, what she has done to the cashmere sweater. She washed it wrong and now it's shrunken," the girl lamented, waving a grey sweater. "This is branded knitwear and she turned it into a rag." Herman just nodded understandingly and gave Christine the green light to buy new branded knitwear. On top of all the accusations, Christine used to sting the worker with sharp words. "You have such an interesting style today, Mary," the girl sneered, casting a contemptuous glance at the cleaning lady in a plain grey dress. "Is it a habit from your prison life to wear such a robe, or have you always had such bad taste?" Another time she wrinkled her nose and demonstratively left the room where Mary was cleaning. "It smells like in prison here. Mary, open the windows and ventilate the room," the girl commanded, walking away. All the time Mary just remained silent, behaved decently, and tried not to cross paths with the harmful Christine any more than necessary. However, later on things took a more serious turn. First, Herman began to lose small sums of money, from a jacket pocket, from a wallet, a little, a couple of bills, the loss of which Herman might not even have noticed. But one day, $300 lay on the bedside table, and he threw them into his pocket. And the next day he wanted to pay for gas and realized that his pocket was empty. "I told you this would all end up like this," Christine rebuked her fiancé, but then, as if mercifully, she hugged his shoulders and whispered hotly in his ear, "It's all because of your kindness. You hire wretched and mean people to work, and look, they're stealing money from you." "It can't be Mary," Herman insisted. "But who else could it be? Do you think it's me? But I don't even use cash." That was true. Christine had received an unlimited card from her wealthy fiancé and used it in boutiques, waving it over terminals like a magic wand. Thanks to such contactless magic, her wardrobe had grown to unprecedented proportions, and an Arab princess would have envied Christine's jewellery reserves. "You need to be stricter with her," the blonde coaxed, sitting on Herman's lap for effect. "She needs to be reined in, otherwise she'll get completely out of control. Today she's taking money from your wallet, but what will she do tomorrow?" "I'll talk to her," Herman sighed, acknowledging that the problem needed to be addressed. "You need to be stricter with her," the blonde coaxed, sitting on Herman's lap for effect. "She needs to be reined in, otherwise she'll get completely out of control. Today she's taking money from your wallet, but what will she do tomorrow?" "I'll talk to her," Herman sighed, acknowledging that the problem needed to be addressed. But he kept putting it off. At first, there was a lot of work, and then it was forgotten in the busyness. And honestly speaking, he didn't want to believe that the kind-hearted Mary was a thief. Although the worm of doubt gnawed at his soul, maybe she really learned it in prison. Life there isn't easy. But as soon as the disappearance of money stopped, Christine's things began to go missing from the house. "She's the one doing it," Christine shouted, throwing her dresses around the room. "She stole my dresses and the perfumes too." "Why would she need your dresses?" Herman tried to calm his bride. "Don't make a fuss. How old is she? Where would she go in your miniskirts? To a disco?" Herman really didn't understand why anyone would need one of Christina's fabulously expensive but obscenely revealing outfits. Mary clearly didn't wear such things. Later, Christine noticed the disappearance of jewellery. "The ring you had given me vanished. I looked everywhere, but it's exactly not in the house," she pouted, complaining about the loss to Herman. "And Pandora's bracelet too, my favourite, by the way." "Maybe they rolled somewhere," Herman suggested, still not wanting to believe the worst. "Of course they rolled away," Christine nodded her beautiful head. "Into the pocket of your criminal. She's probably already sold them and drank the money, or whatever she used to do with stolen money." And once, getting ready for a business meeting, Herman wanted to wear one of his favourite watches. He had a whole collection of wristwatches, but the needed one wasn't in its place. That evening, Herman met with his childhood friend Ryan for a drink. "Why are you so gloomy?" Ryan asked, immediately noticing his friend's troubled look. "Did you have a fight with Christine? Or something at work?" "No, everything's great there." The man waved his hand. "There's trouble at home. Things have started to disappear." "Vanishing or something?" Ryan laughed. "So you know, hire ghost hunters, or, as my grandmother has taught me, say 3 times, 'House elf, play a game and give it back.' Maybe you'll find the missing thing." "Very funny," Herman snorted, good-natured. "I'm telling you seriously, someone is stealing things. At first they took small things, and then expensive jewellery started disappearing from Christine's place. Today my watch is gone." "So, why haven't you gone to the police yet?" the friend asked, pouring the contents of the decanter into glasses. "I don't want to cause a commotion, you understand? I hired a woman who has already served her time. They won't bother to investigate, they'll just send her back to prison. And I can't ruin someone's life like that." "You're too kind, Herman. You have always been." Ryan shook his head disapprovingly, clinking glasses with his friend. "I don't understand how you managed to build a business with such a character. Cheers to your health." "But that's accurately why I succeeded. I didn't cheat, didn't seek extra profit, and acted with a conscience. I'll tell you this, maybe I'm not the richest man, but I sleep well and calmly, and I don't want to take sin on my soul. There are many employees in my house. I can't just blame everything on Mary. Herman answered categorically, downing the fiery drink. She's still such a wonderful woman. I treat her like a mother. And here is such a thing, and such an unpleasant suspicion. Do you know how we can check everything? Ryan said hoarsely, wrinkling his nose from the strength of his drink. You should install hidden cameras in the house and observe who's disturbing your trinkets. Herman found the idea sensible. That way, he could collect evidence and quietly resolve the situation. Deep in his soul, he hardly doubted that Mary was behind it all. But Herman had no idea that installing a video surveillance camera would only be the beginning. The first day of recording showed nothing interesting. Neither did the second nor the third. Everyone in the house was busy with their own duties, not even slacking off from work. Herman was already desperate to catch the culprit red-handed, but on the 8th day of secret surveillance of the house's life, the man noticed another disappearance. Handcrafted cufflinks of white gold, adorned with diamonds and black onyx, were missing from their box. Herman immediately turned on his laptop, opened the necessary program, and started reviewing the recording from his bedroom over the past day. He fast-forwarded through the footage of an empty room for a long time, but then stopped and paled at what he saw. His beloved and beautiful fiancée, Christine, entered the room, looking around. Gracefully swaying her hips, she walked to Herman's drawer of things, opened it, and ran her fingers over the boxes, stopping at the black one. "How could you, Christine?" the man muttered in complete shock and bewilderment, staring at the laptop screen. The reality didn't fit into his head. He gave her everything: housing, love, money. Did she do this because of Mary? Did she decide to frame her? Regardless of the righteous anger burning in the man's chest, he decided to uncover the truth and expose his fiancée. On the advice of Ryan, he hired a detective. The detective completed his job, working off every penny. It turned out that Christine's theft was only the tip of the iceberg of her lies. Her fiancé had a lover who was a compulsive gambler. He talked nonsense to Christine about how he was going to start his own business. The only problem was he never had enough money to make his dream come true. Moreover, he got into trouble and went into debt. If someone helped him, he would definitely return the money with interest. And Christine had the money, or, more precisely, Herman had earned them honestly. So she decided to help her lover at Herman's expense. A cunning plan ripened in her mind: how to frame Mary and get her lover out of debt. At first, Christine just took small sums of money, making it look like it was the cleaner. Then Christine began to steal expensive items and pawn them, giving the money to her lover. Of course, she decided to blame Mary for the disappearance of precious things, who had a criminal past. Upon learning about his fiancée's treachery, Herman decided to be just as cunning as she was. He didn't reveal all of his cards right away. Instead, he planned to catch her in the act. One evening, he showed Mary a new ring with a huge stone that looked incredibly expensive. "Look," he demonstrated the ring. "It's worth a fortune." "You shouldn't leave it at home." The girl fluttered her eyelashes in concern. "Your dear cleaner might steal it." "I've decided to set a trap for our mysterious thief with its help," he confessed. "I'll hide it in the library, where I have a book safe, remember? I'll only tell Mary about it, so she can keep an eye on the ring, and if it gets stolen, then she's definitely guilty. After all, no one except her will know about the ring. Christine approved of the plan and was impressed by her fiancé's resourcefulness. The ring remained in place for 2 days, and then it disappeared. Herman immediately informed Christine about it. "So, is Mary the thief after all, huh? I knew it. Apparently there are no former criminals. She has no conscience. You're going to fire her, aren't you?" she exclaimed, blushing with pleasure and looking into Herman's honest sky-blue eyes. And Herman looked into them and couldn't understand how he had been so wrong. "That means you're the thief, Christine, and also a hypocritical wretch. So, pack your brand-name knit sweaters and don't you ever set foot here again." "But how could you say that?" The girl's lips trembled, tears welling up in her eyes. "You said yourself only your convict knew about the ring." "But in fact, she didn't know about the ring," Herman admitted. "I only told you about it. Not a single living soul knew about it. It's a fake, by the way, just like you, so you can give it to your new sugar daddy. You won't make any money from it anyway." The breakup was loud and theatrical. Christine screamed, begged, pleaded. She threw herself on her knees in front of Herman, swearing her eternal love. "Give me one last chance, Herman," the girl prayed, grabbing her ex-fiancé's hands. "You forgive everyone, always help everyone. You even found work for that woman. But why am I not entitled to a second chance?" Herman was unbending. "You should have behaved yourself. If you continue to break the comedy, I'll call the police and present them with all the evidence of your thievery," Herman replied sternly. "Then we'll see who should really be behind bars, you or Mary." 6 months later, Herman found himself a new, truly lovely fiancée, Savannah. She didn't have the long legs that Christine did, and she never wore dresses with deep décolletage, but her heart was kind and her soul was fair. They soon got married and later had 2 sons. Mary stayed with their family, not as a cleaner, but as a housekeeper. Over time, she became not just part of the staff, but a true member of the family. It's no wonder that Herman's children called her Grandma Mary. In secret from Mary, Herman learned about the fate of Jerry, the man who had betrayed the woman who loved him. He thought he should punish him for such a heinous act, but it turned out that he had been serving time in prison, and so Mary had been working for Herman until her old age. But it was not only a job, but quite a happy life, surrounded by people who appreciated her. Claire grew up in a family of dentists, and from a young age she did not need anything. Her parents, professionals in their field, have always put a priority on good treatment of patients, high quality of work and affordable prices. That is why they decided to open their own dental clinic. Their patient flow only increased year by year and brought in a considerable income. By the time Claire was born, her family could afford to live in splendid conditions of living, travel to expensive resorts, buy fashionable clothes and shoes. When it came to the question of enrolling in university, Claire's parents, as it often happens in doctors' families, were confident that their daughter would follow in their footsteps, but the girl had other plans. Claire easily got into the best law school in the country, and returned home with a law degree. She found a job as an intern at a high-profile law firm and soon, showing good character, was accepted on the staff. A year was enough for her to gain not only experience, but also a name. Claire was glad she did not make a mistake in her choice of profession. Her clients were often ordinary, not wealthy people who were victims of coincidence, and she always tried to do everything to restore justice. And after one of the trials, where Claire proved that her client was not guilty of the accident, she met with Logan. He came to support his friend who had been accused of causing the accident, and after the trial he came over to thank her. He looked at the girl so admiringly that she immediately believed in the sincerity of his words. Thus began their romance. Logan turned out to be a clever and kind man, but he immediately told her that he was not rich, lived with his mother with a disability, and 2 sisters who were still in school. He had studied programming, but dropped out to support his family. He understood he was not a good match for Claire, and would have put up with her refusal, but Claire felt that he was the only one she needed in her life. Soon she insisted that Logan meet her parents. He did not hide his fears about it, as he knew that they would not be pleased with him. But Claire almost dragged him by force to dinner at her parents' house, and, to Logan's great surprise, the evening passed in a warm and friendly atmosphere, and Claire's parents immediately accepted him as their own son. Shortly thereafter, Claire suggested that Logan move in with her. She was a little afraid that everyday life would ruin their relationship, but things got even better because Logan carefully took care of Claire. "Are you going to get married?" Claire's father asked Logan once. "Yes, as soon as I can get back on my feet and provide for us completely. So far my salary only suffices for living expenses," replied Logan. "You know, Logan," the mother stepped in, "when Claire's father and I got married, we didn't even have enough money for food. So it's not an argument," she added, putting an end to the discussion. Soon Logan and Claire got married. Claire knew that Logan was very nervous because almost all the wedding costs were paid by her parents. He was very uncomfortable, but Claire's father made it clear that they loved their daughter just as much as he did, so the wedding had to be a wonderful event. Logan really wanted to be the main breadwinner in the family, and Claire was always amazed at this male character trait in him. The man who grew up without a father, surrounded by women, behaved like a true man, and Claire appreciated it very much. She also became very close to Logan's mother and sisters, and even secretly helped them to buy the girls' clothes, shoes and other gifts. They refused at first, but Claire managed to talk them out of it. Of course, Logan was aware of everything, but his sisters were so happy that he had to put up with it. The only thing that Claire failed at was pleasing Logan's mother. "No need, honey, don't buy me anything. You already do a lot for us," she used to say to Claire. "You just know that Logan loves you very much and cherishes you." Logan was working more and more, but he realized that he was far away from Claire's salary. Claire constantly told him that money was not essential because she was happy with him, and they had enough to live on. But Logan could not calm down, and he continued to come home late from work and even sometimes worked on weekends. One day, Logan told Claire about the idea of his own business. She found it reasonable, but it took a long time to talk him out of taking a bank loan. And after all, he agreed to borrow money from her parents, who happily supported her son-in-law and gave him the full amount right away. Logan fully immersed himself in the new business, worked hard, but after 2 months it turned out that his assistants had just deceived him in the most cowardly way, taking advantage of his inexperience and trustfulness. Logan became bankrupt. He had long been unable to recover from the failure, and then he returned to various part-time jobs. The man barely spoke to Claire, only firmly hugged her in the evenings as if to relieve himself. Upon learning of what had happened, Claire's parents supported their son-in-law, advising him to stop and keep looking for other business options, and promising to provide the necessary help. And Logan was always in search and working to the point of exhaustion. He was so tired that Claire sometimes feared for his health. His search for a job, his guilt over Claire for not giving her the kind of life she deserved, was eating the man up. Now the couple rarely talked, even more rarely went out, neither to visit friends nor to the theatre or to the cinema. Claire did not even start talking about it. She tried to make sure that Logan at least got a good night's sleep and ate some food. The man was always pale, looked tired, and lost even more weight. Even Claire's parents had noticed this, and her mother advised him to have an examination, but Logan categorically refused. He assured her that everything was fine, and as soon as his new business was up and running, everything would be back to normal. Claire's father offered that his son-in-law to take the money for the development, but this time Logan flatly refused, referring to the fact that he had not returned the previous debt. When Logan and Claire remained alone, Logan spoke to his wife for the first time in a high-pitched tone. "That's it. I will not take any more money from your parents. I no longer have any respect for myself, and I feel that you, Claire, despise me," he said so sharply that Claire shuddered. From that day on, he completely isolated himself from her. He only came home for the night and even stopped visiting his mother and sisters. They, like Claire, did not understand what was wrong, but they also began to suspect that something was going on with Logan, and it was not because of the failures in business. Claire could not allow the idea that her husband had another woman, because there was no more honest and decent man in the world. Claire's head was constantly bursting with all sorts of assumptions, especially when her husband increasingly secluded himself in another room to talk on the phone. Worries about her husband occupied Claire so much that it began to reflect negatively on her work. Once she almost lost a case, and only at the last moment was able to pull herself together and bring the line of defense to the winning end. That was the last straw. Claire left the courtroom and headed straight home. When she opened the door, she immediately realized that her husband was home and talking to someone on the phone. She unwittingly overheard Logan refusing some kind of surgery. "Thank you for everything you have done for me, but I don't have opportunity for this right now," Logan said farewell. Claire, realizing that something bad had happened to her husband, she burst into the room and desperately demanded him to tell her the whole truth. But she had not expected how cruel this truth would turn out to be. Immediately after his first unsuccessful attempt at business, Logan felt a severe headache. Without telling his wife or his mother and sisters, he went to the hospital, where he heard that he had a brain tumor. The doctor prescribed a supportive treatment for Logan, but told him that he needed an expensive operation and that the insurance would not cover it in full. Logan was aware of what would happen if he would not have surgery to remove the tumor, but he continued to take pills and postponed the surgery because he first wanted to establish a new business, which he could bequeath to his wife and his mother with his sisters in case of a bad outcome. And now the doctor said that they cannot wait any longer. Claire was shaking with sobs, but suddenly she stood up sharply and shouted through her tears, "Get dressed! Immediately!" Logan obediently got dressed, ready to do anything to get Claire to stop crying. Not half an hour later, Logan was telling Claire's parents the whole story all over again. The father came to his senses first. "Logan, tell me the truth. Why did you marry our daughter? To make her a widow? Great plan, and you know what? You're just a coward. You give up without a fight. All you have in mind is money. Yes, you didn't earn it right away, but why suffer and agonize over it? Why did you see our help as humiliation? Do you think leaving the woman you love as a widow is something to be proud of?" "All right, Ben, stop it." Claire's mother interrupted him and turned to Logan. "We're going to the hospital right now, and no objections," she said menacingly. Seeing how determined her mother was, Claire was again convinced of how dear Logan was to them. But he kept quiet for a moment, and then said that it was late, and there was no need to go anywhere. "No!" Claire went over to her husband and hugged him tightly. "I have heard the doctor say it wasn't too late." "All right, let's go, quick!" the father sharply commanded. All the way, Claire hugged her husband and whispered to him how much she loved and believed in him. She tried to convince him that she was ready to support him in whatever he was doing, because she knew how important it was to him. But no amount of money would replace her beloved man if he would suddenly be gone. From then on, there was the most difficult 4 months for everyone. Surgery after surgery, a week in the intensive care unit, an unquenchable hope in the eyes of the whole family. And soon the day came when the doctor received the results of the tests and finally pleased his patient. "Well, Logan, let's say goodbye. It's your time to go home." Logan did not immediately grasp the meaning of the doctor's words, and when he heard Claire's happy exclamation, he felt tears of joy fill his eyes. But he was not ashamed of that. He felt ashamed for not believing in himself the way Claire had believed in him, for hiding his pain and weakness from her. If he had confessed right away, everything would have gone much easier for everyone. And then Logan gave himself a firm word that from now on there would always be trust in their relationship, and he would never make her cry and worry again. Happy endings happen not only in fairy tales. There were still many difficult moments in Claire and Logan's life, but there was much more happiness in it. Logan finally set up his business, and it allowed him to send his mother abroad for medical treatment and give his sisters an excellent education. And 3 years later, when the couple had a little daughter who looked so much like Claire, they became truly happy, and nothing could have changed that. A young girl sat motionless on the edge of the bench and gazed blankly into the distance with her huge grey eyes. Despite her rather scruffy appearance, she was pretty. The chilly breeze was ruffling her thick but unwashed blonde hair, and occasionally made her nervously pull her thin, dirty jacket across her chest. The suburban station platform was crowded at this time, but people were walking by, occasionally bumping into the trembling poor figure and quickly averting their eyes, hurrying on with their business. Ben Harper was sitting on one of the nearby benches. He silently watched the girl and sighed heavily from time to time. Every weekend he would leave the station and go to his summer house that he had bought just after he had retired. He spent every weekend there and sometimes lived there for weeks at a time. The man was lonely. He had devoted all his life to his work in the prosecutor's office, and he had never had a family. It happened a few days ago. He was waiting for the train to his summer cottage when he noticed this girl there for the first time. He could not understand why, but at that moment his heart ached, reminding him of an old heart wound that had never been fully healed. The first time, he simply walked by because he was worried that he would miss his train. But all day long, trying to do his gardening, he was unable to concentrate in any way. A strange pain in his heart troubled him day and night, and in front of his eyes, like an obsession, there was the face of that girl from the station. The resemblance was striking. The girl was like two peas in a pod with Sarah, his first and only love, whom he had so foolishly lost. Sarah was the prettiest girl around. Mr. Harper, madly in love with her, was painfully aware of their social inequality and was constantly jealous of everyone. Mr. Harper always felt that he, being the son of a cleaning lady and not knowing his father, was not a good match for Sarah, who was born in a family of a successful realtor and a plastic surgeon. He was afraid that Sarah would soon realize this too. He was so jealous of everyone around her. They used to fight about it a lot. Then they would make up. But one day Sarah's patience ran out, and she said that it was all over between them. Mr. Harper didn't show up for a couple of months, holding a grudge, but finally, realizing that his life had no meaning without Sarah, he came to her with flowers to ask for forgiveness. But it was too late. Sarah had moved away, and no work connections helped him find his girlfriend. Mr. Harper was anxious, nearly went crazy, began drinking alcohol, and then was able to stop and pull himself together, plunging himself into work. Over time, the pain subsided, but his personal life never worked out. However, Mr. Harper did not complain about life. He believed that everything was well, and he planned to live quietly in retirement. But the meeting at the station awakened long-forgotten memories in him, and now they would not let him live in peace. He was suffering for 2 days, convincing himself that everything would be all right with the girl. But back in the city, Mr. Harper saw her again in the same place. Now he couldn't stand it and went up to her. "Why are you sitting here all the time? What happened to you?" he asked. "I don't know," whispered the stranger in a lifeless voice. Mr. Harper was puzzled by her answer, but in the next second he forcefully held out his hand and told her to follow him. The girl looked at him, grabbed his hand, and then stood up, but suddenly staggered. Mr. Harper realized that most likely she had not eaten anything for these days. Once they got to his home, Mr. Harper gave her some bath things and the clothes he had bought on the way. And while the stranger was taking a shower, he ordered takeout from a cafe. When his guest came out of the bathroom, clean and combed, Mr. Harper thought she looked even more like Sarah. He even imagined that by that age she could have been his and Sarah's granddaughter, but unfortunately he had ruined everything himself. Mr. Harper set the table and offered dinner. When it was time for tea, he cautiously asked the girl what her name was. I don't remember," she answered and started crying. Mr. Harper already regretted that he had asked and decided that tomorrow he would show the poor girl to Dr. Simmons, his friend the psychiatrist, hoping that he would help the stranger. But Dr. Simmons was not so optimistic. Without knowing the causes of amnesia, it was difficult to make any predictions. After the examination, he said that, judging by the tests, the girl had been given some kind of substance, and the portion was so high that it had provoked the loss of memory. Her health is apparently strong because she had survived, and her mental health had not been affected, Dr. Simmons summed up. Her memory should return to her on its own, but I can't tell you the time frame. The main thing for her now is a quiet life. After listening to the verdict, Mr. Harper decided to take his ward to his country house. Life in nature helped the girl regain her vitality, and a smile began to appear on her face. It turned out that she was a good cook and loved gardening, but her memory was never recovered. One day the girl was enthusiastically pruning a hedge, and Mr. Harper was watering roses nearby, thinking aloud. "Bushes are good, honey, but I love flowers, especially roses. They're the reason I bought this house. When I came to see it, I thought it was heaven on earth. The roses bloomed so beautifully," laughed Mr. Harper, but suddenly lost his voice when he saw how his ward fell to the ground with a cry. Mr. Harper brought ammonia from home and revived the girl. "I have remembered everything. My name is Alice, and I have been robbed," she whispered and burst into tears. "And I don't have a home anymore, and I don't have a job either," she added, sobbing. After calming down a little, Alice said that she had never known her father and that her mother had died under the wheels of a car when she was only 5 years old. She was placed in an orphanage, and when she grew up, she returned to her mother's apartment, learned a pastry cooking profession, and got a job. She was dreaming of saving up for a country house, but she knew it would take years. And suddenly a businessman decided to construct a shopping mall on the site of her block, so he bought out all the apartments for good money. Alice began to look through advertisements for houses for sale. She immediately came across a lovely place with a big rose garden. There was such an aroma there that Alice immediately decided to buy it. "That's why, when you mentioned roses, something immediately clicked in my head, and my memory came back," Alice explained. Then Alice remembered that the landlady was a decent-looking elderly woman, and they arranged to meet at the notary's office. After signing the contract and handing over the money, Alice agreed to go with the woman to a cafe and have coffee together. And that was the last thing she could remember. She woke up in a muddy puddle outside the train station. Barely making it to a bench on the platform, she sat there until Mr. Harper approached her. "Thank you, Mr. Harper. There are no more compassionate people like you," she added at the end. "Do you mind if I stay with you a little longer? I just don't have anywhere to go, but I'll get a job and reimburse you for all your expenses." "Live as long as you need to, of course. It's your home now, too," Mr. Harper hastily replied. The owner of the cafe where Alice used to work gladly took her back, as she valued the talented pastry chef very much. After she had disappeared, she tried to look for her. She even filed a complaint with the police, but it was not accepted. At Mr. Harper's insistence, Alice filed a police report, but the case ended up unsolved. The notary was a fake, and the sale contract was a lie, and the swindlers covered up all traces of their fraud. Mr. Harper was desperate to do something to help the poor girl, and decided to try to find her relatives, or rather to make sure that there was no one left. He asked Alice for a photo of her mother and put up an ad on all the web resources dealing with missing person searches. A couple of weeks later, he got a phone call. A woman's voice on the phone, who sounded familiar, excitedly asked about the photo on the site. "I'm Paula's mother. What's wrong with her? I haven't seen her in over 20 years. Mr. Harper was tensely silent, not knowing how to tell the woman who called that her daughter had died. Gathering his strength, he replied, I'm sorry, but your daughter is dead. But you have a granddaughter, Alice, who is all grown up now." He heard sobs, and then the woman asked for the address and said she would come soon. In the evening, Mr. Harper told Alice about the call, and she was thrilled to find out that she had a real grandmother. She impatiently awaited her arrival, while Mr. Harper was sad, realizing he would soon lose his newfound close person. Alice, seeing that the elderly became upset, bustled about him, prepared him a hot tea, saying that he needed to take care of himself because there are no more people like him. And Mr. Harper was looking at Alice and thought that apparently this was his fate, to die alone. With these thoughts, Mr. Harper was up all night, and in the morning the doorbell rang. When he opened the door, he was numb. There was his Sarah, standing on the threshold. She had gotten older, but she was as beautiful as ever. "Ben?" said the woman in shock, and began to sink to the floor. Mr. Harper picked Sarah up and carried her to the couch. When she came to her senses, she immediately told the whole story. Her daughter Paula had always been stubborn and willful, but she studied well and even graduated with honours. Her studies at a prestigious university were ahead of her, but unfortunately she met Trevor, who had already had several criminal records at the age of 24. Sarah, of course, was against their relationship, but she put too much pressure on her daughter and she ran away from home. Sarah used all the connections, but they could not find her. The elderly woman became silent, tears welling up in her eyes. "I'm sorry," was all Mr. Harper could say, "but you still have a beautiful granddaughter." "Mr. Harper, you have her too now," Sarah said with a sigh. Mr. Harper's heart raced and he looked at Sarah with incomprehensible eyes. "Yes, Mr. Harper, Alice is your granddaughter too, and Paula was our daughter. I didn't know I was pregnant when I had left then." When Alice returned from work and saw the grey-haired woman looking lovingly into her eyes, she immediately understood everything, and barely restraining her sobs, threw herself into her arms. Soon Mr. Harper and Sarah were married and joined their lives together, albeit late. Alice was happy because she found the family she had been deprived of for so many years. Before turning 35, Helen was left alone by her beloved husband Ben, who left her for a young and playful paramedic, Trudy. Trudy had come to their village after finishing medical school and had her eye on a married man with 2 children. Ben was tall, handsome, and worked as a veterinarian on a farm, so they became close on the subject of curing people and animals. When Ben said he was leaving, Helen fell to his feet, begging him not to go. How could she live without him? They had 2 children together, Peter, who was 5 years old, and Susan, who was 3. But Ben kept saying the same thing. He wouldn't abandon their children, he would help, but his true love was Trudy, and he left with just 1 suitcase. Then they moved to a neighbouring district with his new wife. Helen cried and cried, but then she pulled herself together. It wasn't right for her children to see their mother always crying, and although she loved him more than life itself, she was able to strangle that love in her heart. She worked, took care of the children, and became both their father and mother. Ben had promised a lot, but he only kept his promises in words. In the 10 years since he left his family, he never once visited his son or daughter, only sent small alimony. He didn't even send birthday cards to the children, even though he lived only 100 kilometers away from the village where his former family lived. The children cried for their dad at first, but then they got used to it, and Helen got used to being without male support. She worked in the farm canteen during the planting and harvesting seasons, and in the farm in the winter. She did everything to ensure that her children lacked nothing. She didn't look at men anymore. Now she saw them as a source of pain and betrayal. Helen became like a robot. Work, home, children, and that was it. No personal life, no joy. Although she had joy, admiring how her children grew up and how well they studied. It was the most important thing in her life. But sometimes at night, Helen would cry over her ruined woman life. No one would hug her, cuddle her. But in the morning the tears were forgotten, and she used to rush to work again, then to her children. She cooked, washed, sewed, even helped them with their studies. She was always good at math, but she couldn't turn that skill into a profession. Her parents were poor. They couldn't afford to teach her, and then she got married. In general, things turned out the way they did. And then terrible news came. Helen learned that Ben and Trudy had died. They were hit by a train at a railway crossing while driving a service car. Helen cried with her children. Even though they hadn't seen for a long time, she felt sorry for Ben. And Trudy, even though she was a homewrecker, she certainly didn't deserve such a horrible fate. Helen even decided to go to the funeral. But then she found out that Trudy's elderly parents were going to bury Ben and their daughter in the city where they lived. And Helen also learned that Ben and Trudy had a daughter left behind. She was 10 years old at the time. Trudy's parents couldn't take her in. They were both sick, barely able to walk, and other relatives apparently refused to be involved. Ben's sister, who had approved of her brother when he had left Helen, immediately declared that she had 4 of her own children to feed and wouldn't be able to take in her niece. In short, after the funeral, they planned to take Amanda to an orphanage. Upon learning of this, Helen became pensive and distracted. She cooked in the canteen, and because of this thoughtfulness, she either poured more salt than necessary or even sugared the potatoes once. The director scolded her at first, but then realized that something was troubling her. She asked, and Helen spilled everything. "I can't get Amanda out of my head. I understand that she's a stranger to me, but she's Ben's daughter, and I loved him. Yes, I forced myself to forget, or at least I thought I did. But my heart still aches when I remember him, and when I think about what he had to endure in his last moments. I feel sorry for him to tears, and there's no anger. And now this little girl. Can you imagine losing both parents at once? And her relatives don't want her." "Helen, what are you thinking?" scolded the director. "Don't be foolish. What do you need this girl for? You have to raise your own children. Peter will finish school in a couple of years, and then he'll need to study further, and Susan is growing up too. I understand all that, but I feel sorry for the girl," Helen answered, lowering her head. And then she made a decision. She went to the neighbouring district, found out everything, and saw Amanda. Her grandparents were still watching over her. The old people were crying because they couldn't take the girl with them to the city. They could barely walk. It's a good thing that kind people helped with their daughters' and son-in-law's funerals, but they couldn't afford to take care of their granddaughter. When they found out who Helen was, they were confused. Why did she want this? But Helen simply said, "Amanda is my children's sister. How can I abandon her?" Trudy's parents were amazed, and then they thanked the woman warmly for saving their granddaughter from an orphanage. Amanda turned out to be a sweet girl, well-mannered and quiet. She cried a lot about her dead parents. Helen comforted her as best she could and promised her that everything would be fine. She would get to know her brother and sister, and the pain would fade away. And Amanda trustingly hugged the woman. No, Helen didn't try to become her mother. She was just a good friend to the lonely girl. But her 15-year-old son, Peter, and 13-year-old daughter, Susan, didn't like their little sister. They saw her only as the one who had taken their father away from them. Helen scolded them in vain when Amanda was not there. I was able to forgive the offence, and Amanda is not to blame for anything. So please stop treating her so badly. She is your sister. But her own children were like deaf. Then they developed a new tactic. They started to pretend that Amanda didn't exist. If they sat down to eat without their mother, they didn't call Amanda to the table and shooed her away from the TV, and didn't call her by name. Susan, who shared a room with Amanda, even drew a line that she was not allowed to cross, and if she did, Susan would rough up her little sister. Amanda didn't complain to Helen. The girl thought it was still better than being in an orphanage, which she had heard so much about before. Helen saw that her own children didn't accept the girl, but she hoped that everything would be okay soon. After all, time heals and adds wisdom. But time passed and nothing changed. Peter had already finished school and gone to the city to study to be a car mechanic, and Susan had grown up and dreamed of becoming a doctor after school. Helen supported her children in their aspirations, and she didn't forget about Amanda. She tried to pay more attention to her, and her own children didn't seem to notice that their mother was torn between them and this stray, as they called Amanda, among themselves. Susan kept a watchful eye on her younger sister, ensuring she didn't take her things or cosmetics. When Helen moved Amanda into Peter's old room, Susan breathed a sigh of relief, and Amanda tried to stay out of Susan's sight. It was quieter that way. Peter seemed to be all grown up, but sometimes he acted like a wicked child. Once he came for Christmas and brought small gifts for his mother and sister, a scarf for Helen and cosmetics for Susan. Amanda was sitting at the dining table, lowering her eyes so that it wouldn't be obvious that she also would like to get a gift. Peter looked at her and smiled mysteriously. "What are you sitting there for, little one?" he chuckled. "I have something for you too." And he pulled out a large chocolate bar from his suitcase. Helen couldn't afford to buy plenty of sweets for the children, and if she did, it was something simpler. But this chocolate bar was simply huge. Amanda's face lit up. She smiled and timidly took the treat. "Thank you," she whispered gratefully. "You're welcome," Peter answered jokingly and smiled again. Susan looked at her brother in bewilderment. How could he be so generous to this little pest? Has he gone crazy? "Let's eat it together with tea," Amanda exclaimed joyfully and unwrapped the chocolate bar. Looking at what was inside, her face immediately changed, tears glistening in her eyes. Helen, seeing what was in the rustling foil, paled with indignation. Peter, her adult son, decided to tease Amanda. Inside the wrapper was a neatly rolled rectangular piece of tar. "Peter, what kind of joke is this?" Helen protested. "Are you out of your mind?" "What's wrong?" her son replied, barely holding back laughter. "It's good tar. I barely got it from the boys at the construction school. Look how evenly I rolled it out. Now Amanda doesn't need any gum. It will last her a month." And he and Susan burst out laughing and ran into her room, where Peter treated her with the chocolate bar he had brought. Amanda sat there silently in the kitchen, tears dropping onto the pseudo-chocolate. "Fools!" Helen scolded. "Just fools! Don't cry, my dear. I'll buy you another one, even better." And she did, a little later. And then in the spring, Amanda's maternal aunt, Julia, suddenly showed up. Julia was already in her 50s, had no children or husband, worked as a seamstress, and lived in the capital. She knew nothing about Amanda, but then she met some relatives who told her about Trudy's daughter. By then, Trudy's parents were no longer alive, and Julia felt sorry for the girl. How was she living with her father's ex-wife? This woman was probably teasing the orphan girl, taking out her anger on the defenseless child. Imagining this, Julia found Helen's address and visited her. And she almost immediately realized she had been wrong. Helen loved Amanda and took care of her like her own daughter. But Helen's children... So, Julia offered to take Amanda with her. At first Helen refused, and Amanda was against it too. She was used to her stepmother and even loved her. As for the way Peter and Susan behaved towards her, Amanda tried not to pay attention. But Julia persuaded both of them that it would be better for the girl to live in the capital. Better education, spacious 3-room apartment, museums, libraries, parks. Julia was alone, and the loneliness was driving her crazy. With Amanda, they would live well together. The main thing was that the girl would be safe and happy. "Please understand," Julia told Helen when Amanda left the room. "I want to help you. I understand how torn you are. You love your children and Amanda. You forgave your husband, didn't you? But your children haven't forgotten the offence, and they will take out this anger on Amanda all her life. All 3 of them are unhappy because of this." "Maybe you're right," Helen nodded thoughtfully. "I sometimes think that I'm not doing something right. I love all 3 of them, and they're like enemies to each other, even though they're related by blood. They will understand with age, both Peter and Susan, that they were wrong. And now, let's decide something, otherwise it can be not far from trouble. Amanda is entering puberty. It's unknown how she will react to the next attack of her brother and sister." "And I'm scared," Helen admitted. "And if you think about it, Peter and Susan are closer to me, of course, but I'm ashamed in front of Amanda. I promised her that I wouldn't give her to anyone, and it turns out that I lied." "You didn't lie. It just didn't quite work out. It happens, and Amanda will be fine with me. We just need to convince her to go with me. I'm attached to her very much, although she's the daughter of a woman who had broken my family." Helen sobbed, wiping away tears. The women didn't notice that Amanda was standing behind the door and heard everything. The girl understood how difficult it was for Helen to choose between her and her own children, and Amanda wisely decided not to torment her second mother anymore. After all, no matter how you look at it, her presence will always remind her of her husband's betrayal, and Peter and Susan would calm down. It's better to communicate at a distance. That same evening, Amanda said she would go with Julia. Helen cried, hugging the girl who had become dear to her over this time, and the girl cried, promising to write letters and that they would definitely see each other again. Peter and Susan finally breathed a sigh of relief that they had finally fused this stray. Years went by, and Susan left her mother long ago. She graduated, as she had dreamed, as a doctor. She and her brother lived in the city, each with their own families and jobs. They came to their mother's house for the holidays. Amanda didn't get lost either. She often wrote to Helen, even came to visit her from the capital. Julia, as promised, raised Amanda with love and care. Amanda graduated as a fashion designer. Now she had her own atelier, and she got married. She even established communication with Peter and Susan, but only at a distance. They called each other, congratulated each other on holidays. Time passed. Helen didn't notice how she aged. Now she was 80. It was hard for her alone in the village, but she was used to it, and she didn't complain. She shuffled around the house slowly but surely. And then Peter arrived. He looked thoughtful and unhappy. Helen immediately sensed that something was wrong with her son and asked him directly what was bothering him. Peter admitted that he had some problems. Recently, Tom, Peter's son, got married, and they all lived together in Peter's 2-room apartment. The young couple needs their own space, you understand, Mum? Especially since Yulia, Tom's wife, is pregnant. I don't know how we can all continue to live together. My wife is nervous. Tom takes any job he can get, and I never leave the auto repair shop. But we still don't have enough money for a down payment to take out a mortgage. Peter paused for a moment and continued, Mum, I was thinking, maybe we could sell your house? But where will I live, my son? The elderly woman asked, confused. Oh, Mum, we won't abandon you, Peter exclaimed. We'll take you with us. You'll stay in Tom's room. They will move to their place after getting a mortgage. Oh, I don't know, son. Helen shook her head. I'm afraid to leave my own home. And what will Susan say? She'll be upset that she didn't inherit anything from her mother's home. Why should Susan be upset? Peter shrugged. She has an apartment with her husband, a car, a country house. They have good salaries. They've already bought an apartment for their daughter. And not with a mortgage. Susan is living the good life, while I've been working hard my whole life. What's the point of helping her? Helen felt so sorry for her firstborn, and she decided to help. What else did she have left? She would live with her son until the end, and they wouldn't hurt her. They were all family. The house was sold quickly, and Helen was moved to the city. Her daughter-in-law, Rosanna, seemed to welcome her warmly. Live and be happy, Mum, she cried. No need to light a fireplace to warm up the house or shovel snow. See how good everything is. At first Helen was pleased. She had settled in comfortably and had helped her grandson. He took out a mortgage and bought an apartment in just 2 days, and he and his wife moved. Great. Susan, however, was a little upset that such a decision had been made about her mother without her. Since you've decided that way, she told her mother angrily, then live with them. But if Rosanna drives you out, don't even think about coming to me. I don't have a place for you. I'm telling you right now. Why would she drive me out, dear daughter? Helen smiled. I helped them. I'm sorry you didn't get anything from me. Is that why you're upset? Oh my God, I don't need your money. Susan rolled her eyes. You just don't know your daughter-in-law well. But remember that I won't be able to take you in. If anything happens, you'll go to a nursing home, said Susan. And as if she hit her mother with these words, Helen shuddered. She didn't deserve to hear that. A month passed, 2, 6 months, and it turned out Susan was right. Rosanna began to change before her eyes. She reproached her mother-in-law for shuffling loudly, dropping crumbs when she ate, and watching soap operas. She was angry that an elderly woman became disorderly and sometimes broke the dishes, and that she had to help her in the bathroom. The daughter-in-law would scold and insult her mother-in-law, calling her smelly and sloppy. The son never stopped his wife, only averting his eyes. And then Helen would cry in her room from the hurt. She had helped her children, but they forgot her kindness. Neither her son nor daughter-in-law asked for forgiveness. And soon Peter suggested, Mum, how about a nursing home? Everyone would be happier that way. It's nice there. They provide food and care, and you'll have company. Maybe you'll even get remarried. There are men there, too. Helen's heart sank with bitterness. What men? She asked her son. I never thought about that when I was young. I was too busy raising you and your sister. Why do I need all this now? Look at her, she's still arguing. The daughter-in-law, who was also present at the conversation, exclaimed, Nobody's really asking you anyway. Let's just pack her things and take her there. I'm so tired of all this. I can't take it anymore. Helen didn't say anything. She just cried. Her son and Rosanna left her without even acknowledging her tears. They started looking for a nursing home, and Susan was tasked with it too. She stormed over to her brother's house one Sunday. Helen was in her room and didn't come out, but she heard everything. "When you took in our mother, you should have thought ahead," Susan yelled. "You wanted the apartment for your son. You have to live within your means. I told you and Mother that I wouldn't take her in. I have a job. I need to relax at home, and Andrew won't agree. You know he's a talented surgeon. He needs to be at peace at home." "I've checked 2 nursing homes," the brother replied apologetically, "but we can't get into the state-run ones. We can go to a private nursing home." "A private one?" Susan exclaimed. "Have you seen the prices there? Mother's pension isn't enough. Are you going to pay, or should I? I have my own expenses. My daughter is studying abroad." "What are we supposed to do then?" The brother shrugged. "I have an idea," Susan said, lowering her voice. Helen didn't hear what they talked about, nor did she want to. The tears were choking her. She found herself unwanted in her old age. That's what she had raised her children for. Susan, her brother, and Rosanna whispered to each other, made an agreement, and left on a good note. Her daughter never came to say goodbye. The next day, Peter told his mother to get ready. "For the nursing home?" asked the elderly woman, her voice trembling. "Yes," Peter replied, dropping his eyes. There was nothing to do. The elderly woman gathered her humble belongings. Her son took her out of the house, put her in Susan's car, and the 3 of them drove somewhere. Helen no longer cried. She had resigned herself, and maybe it would be better there, in the nursing home, more peaceful, and she did not have much time left. Helen even fell asleep in the car, and when she opened her eyes, she was horrified. They had arrived at the cemetery. "Son, daughter, where have you brought me?" cried the mother. "I'm still alive." "Mum, live as long as you want," Susan replied indignantly, not even turning around from the wheel. "We found you a good home. Here, in the cemetery. It's a guardhouse. You can even live there in the winter. And there's a stove and all the amenities." "What kind of amenities can there be here?" Helen objected, wiping away her tears. "Oh, Mum, don't be capricious," her son replied from the front passenger seat. "You've lived like this in the village all your life, and you can do it here too. And besides, you'll have an assistant, the cemetery guard. He lives right there. A good elderly man. He agreed to look after you for a small fee," her daughter continued. "And also, Mum, don't be offended, but I'll keep your pension card. I'll use it to pay the guard and bring you food." Hearing all this, Helen trembled. Her own children were going to throw her away like garbage. At that moment, the guard approached the car. He turned out to be a shabby-looking man, clearly fond of hitting the bottle. "Well, where's the old lady?" he croaked, peering into the car. "Ah, there she is. Well, hello, Granny. Let's go get acquainted." And he laughed so hard that all 3 in the car shuddered. But nevertheless, the son and daughter pulled their mother out of the car and let her go to the guardhouse. The elderly woman was so horrified that she couldn't feel her legs. Suddenly, someone called out to them at the gate. They turned around and saw a slim, pretty and stylishly dressed woman in her 40s. "Helen, is that you?" the woman exclaimed in surprise. "Peter, Susan, what's going on here?" "Amanda!" exclaimed Helen. "What are you doing here?" I came to visit my parents' graves, and then I was going to visit you in the village. What's all this about?" "It's none of your business," Susan screamed and tried to pull her mother away. But somehow Helen broke free from her daughter and son's tight grip, ran up to Amanda and told her what was happening here. "Did you bring our mother here to live?" Amanda whispered in horror, looking at Peter and Susan. "To a cemetery, to an unknown man. Who are you after that?" "She's our mother, and it's our right to decide where she lives," Peter replied arrogantly. "And you, stray, don't tell us how to live." "And I won't," Amanda replied shortly and waved to someone in an expensive car. The driver, a tall, stout guy, got out of the car, and as soon as Susan and Peter saw him, they immediately backed away, and the guard ran back to his booth. Amanda hugged Helen and led her to the car. "You're coming with me, Helen," Amanda said firmly. "You'll live with me. By the way, meet my son Philip, your grandson." The guy smiled friendlily. "Amanda, what? Why do you need me?" Helen repeated, confused. "After all, I couldn't give you everything you needed in your time." "You gave me the most important thing, your love," Amanda cried. "When no one needed me, you saved me, and I won't abandon you. As for Peter and Susan, God will judge them for everything. And don't ever blame yourself for giving me to Aunt Julia. She gave me love and care, but you gave me the most important thing, an understanding that it's essential to know how to forgive." "My dear girl," Helen cried, and those were tears of joy. Molly always loved children, which is why she deliberately chose a career in education. After graduating from university, she found a job teaching language and literature at a school. Her students loved her because she always tried to present the material in a way that would interest her class, and she was very successful at it. By the age of 25, she had already become one of the best teachers in the city, and she was very proud of it. However, her personal life was not going well. None of her suitors attracted Molly, and she didn't see any good prospects for herself. But one day, at a local literary meeting, she met a wonderful and sensitive young man named Edward. Their acquaintance gradually developed, and Molly fell in love with her Edward. He was so attentive, elevated, and romantic. In a word, he was a prince from a fairy tale. He even wrote poetry for Molly and proposed in the best tradition of knights. He sang a serenade under her window, kneeling on one knee. Of course, Molly couldn't refuse, nor did she want to. They got married, but during the preparation for the wedding, an unpleasant situation arose. Edward didn't have a job at the moment. He was working on writing his own collection of poems, which he planned to sell to a publishing house later. "Well, then we'll have to cut back on the wedding ceremony," Molly sighed. "No, what are you talking about?" Edward's eyes filled with fear. "How can we do that?" "There can only be one wedding, and it must be beautiful. You know that as soon as I finish my book, it will be snatched up by any publishing house, and we will be sitting on sacks of money. But there's not much left, so we don't have to worry about money, and we shouldn't skimp on the wedding. Let's take out a loan." "A loan?" Molly hesitated. On the one hand, of course, she wanted the wedding day to be special and memorable, but on the other hand, going into debt was not to her liking. "What's wrong with loans? Everyone lives like this now." Edward shrugged. "We'll pay it back in no time. We'll have to make a couple of payments, and I'll compensate for the rest." "Well, if you're so sure about it," the girl sighed, agreeing with the groom's plan. "Of course I'm certain." The young man smiled and ran his hand over the bride's cheek. "You're such a beauty that I'll do anything for you." Molly was delighted, but she didn't think then that Edward was willing to do anything for her, but only at the expense of a loan in her name. After all, he didn't work, and no one would give him any money. So everything was decided. They had a lavish wedding and went into debt. Molly's relatives, of course, didn't support such an initiative and tried to dissuade her, but she already had a plan for the perfect wedding in her head. To all reasonable arguments, she insisted on one thing. "This is my wedding. Can't I afford to be luxurious once in my life?" No one could object, so the ceremony went as the bride and groom wanted. They were about to go on a honeymoon to the sea, but then the bank refused to give them a loan. So, instead of Greece, they had to go to Egypt. The tickets were purchased by relatives. Edward was unhappy that they couldn't visit Greece and grumbled throughout the entire vacation. Molly, on the other hand, tried to relax as much as possible. She understood that their newly formed family would only be held together by her fragile female shoulders for now, but reassured herself with the thought that it wouldn't be for long. When they returned home, Molly immediately went back to work. Edward moved in with his wife, as he had lived with his mother before and did not have his own place. "Well, this is all temporary. We'll have a really big house for sure," Molly thought. And it wouldn't have been so bad if the bank didn't require regular payments. Her husband didn't demand delicious food and a clean house, and Molly didn't try to keep up with everything. Finally, it became clear that she couldn't handle everything alone. "Listen, when are you going to finish your book?" Molly asked, somewhat irritably. Edward tore himself away from his laptop, where he was watching a series, and gazed at his wife with undisguised irritation. With one hand she stirred the soup in the pot, while with the other she flipped the cutlets. "It's art, Molly. It takes time. I don't have the inspiration to write, and I just can't do it at the click of a button," the guy replied. "So maybe you should get a job then," Molly suggested. Edward was so shocked that he was silent for almost a minute and simply blinked his long eyelashes. "What am I supposed to do? Should I, a poet, be a longshoreman?" "Oh no, why a longshoreman?" Molly covered the pot with a lid and turned to her husband. "For example, we have an opening for a teacher of fine arts." "I don't have a pedagogical education to work with children," grumbled Edward. "And besides, I don't recognize any art except poetry. And this children's scribble will only bring out more of it." "We have a private school. I think I can arrange for you to be accepted without a pedagogical education, at least for a couple of hours," continued the woman, ignoring his excuses. "You are, it seems, an art historian by education. I think this will be suitable for working as a teacher." "Do you even hear me?" the man exploded. "I don't want to look at these scribbles that your students can squeeze out of themselves, let alone evaluate them. I'm a poet, not an artist, and even if I were an artist, I simply couldn't stand the drawings of schoolchildren." "Everyone has to start somewhere," Molly calmly replied. "Children draw poorly, but you will be able to work and help me pay off the loan." "Oh, I see," Edward sneered. "You need money. Of course, everyone needs money. You don't appreciate love, care and tenderness." "You know what, Edward?" Molly exclaimed, throwing the spoon into the sink. "And where do you love and care for me? You could help me do something around the house for once. I work at school, clean at home, cook lunch, go to the store, and you just pretend to be busy." "I work!" Edward turned crimson. "Where is the result?" Molly crossed her arms over her chest and added with challenge. "If you're a poet, show me your latest poem." Edward fell silent and stared at his hands. Molly even felt sorry for him. After all, he was a creative, sensitive person. She knew who she married, so why shout now? "I understand you, Molly," Edward said when she was already about to apologize. "Okay, ask about the vacancy. I'll start working at your school, just so that you don't feel so overwhelmed." It required great effort for Molly to remain silent and nod. The woman turned away from her husband, returning to the preparation of dinner. The next day, she found a free minute and went to the school principal's office to talk about Edward. Molly spent half an hour describing what a wonderful husband she had, how much he loved children, what a brilliant art historian he was. It didn't matter that he wrote poetry. He understood all the arts perfectly and would do great with the job. "I understand," replied the school director with a smile. "Children really need a good teacher. Of course, with education it would be even better. But our previous employee left 6 months ago. There was no one to teach drawing to the kids. Well, let's take a closer look at your husband. For now, we'll put him on a trial period of 2 weeks, and then we'll make it official." "Oh, thank you so much," beamed Molly. "Well, it's not a big deal. Can he start tomorrow?" "Of course he can," nodded Molly. "Great. Then we'll wait for him. By the way, Molly, you have such a talent for teaching. Would you like to work as a tutor on the side? Many parents of our students ask for private lessons for their children, and they want you specifically. Of course, payment is separate." "Oh, this is so unexpected and very, very pleasant," smiled Molly. "I'm happy to do it." "Wonderful. Then I'll give out your contacts. It's very pleasant to talk and work with you," praised Tatiana. "Thank you," said Molly. "I'm glad to work in your school." Molly went home happy. Now Edward could earn money and she could breathe freely. Edward took the news of his job with the philosophical wisdom and humility of a monk. "Okay." The man briefly stated his position, listening to his wife's emotional story. "I'll go watch one more episode." For Molly, such behaviour was incomprehensible and offensive. She was trying for their family. She got an additional part-time job and helped him get a job at her school, instead of unloading wagons, but he was still dissatisfied. Well, okay, maybe he is just upset and the lack of money is affecting him. Of course, it is just a difficult period, Molly decided. Edward began to go to work, showing his unwillingness to be there. Molly had to kick him out of bed in the morning, scold him, shout throughout the apartment, just so her husband would wake up and begrudgingly start getting ready. Molly thought it couldn't go on like this for long. But then suddenly, Edward even enjoyed working. He started waking up without shouting in the mornings and stopped being late. Soon, the director decided to keep him at work. Molly's joy knew no bounds. Edward seemed to have started working on his book again. At least he was typing something on his laptop and making notes in his notebook. Molly didn't ask any questions to avoid distracting her husband, nor did she have time. The director wasn't joking when she said that many wanted to see Molly as a tutor. 15 people expressed a desire to study with her additionally. Molly somehow managed to schedule them for every workday. Of course, there was only 1 session per week for each child, but it was better than nothing, as parents said. But she really wasn't expecting so many people who wanted to have additional lessons. Refusing was somehow inconvenient, so Molly spun like a hamster in a wheel. In the morning, she finished checking homework, then ran to school, held lessons, ate, rushing, and then ran to people's homes. Molly had no fewer than 2 tutoring sessions per day. On Saturday, on her day off, she cleaned the house, bought groceries, and tried to cook as much as possible. Sunday, the woman usually spent like in a fog. She checked the pupils' homework, made a syllabus, and then went to bed without energy. Molly lost interest in everything that used to be interesting to her. She did not get any pleasure from life. Because of her irregular and unhealthy diet, she began to have problems with her skin and weight. Because of lack of sleep and fatigue, her hair began to fall out, her nails became brittle, huge bags formed under her eyes, and she began to experience pain all over her body that could not be relieved by any painkillers. Later, she also developed kidney problems. In general, she was in a bad state. After a year of living like this, Molly was unrecognizable to her old acquaintances. She looked like a ghost. However, she was unable to change anything because she was still paying off her credit. Her husband Edward never learned to earn a decent income, so she had to work hard. One day, during her day off on a Sunday, Edward approached her while she was lying down and staring at the ceiling. "Molly, we need to talk," he said with a tragic sigh. "What's wrong?" Molly asked indifferently. "You know, things have definitely changed lately," Edward began. "You can't be recognized at all. You stopped enjoying life, immersed yourself in your work, you don't notice anything that's happening around. And, by the way, the most important things are happening around. You didn't even notice that I'm often not at home. Or do you not care? In any case, I can't live like this anymore. I didn't marry such a girl, so I'm filing for divorce." Molly smiled, or snorted. "Go ahead." "Aren't you even going to fight for our relationship?" asked Edward in shock. "There's nothing to fight for," Molly said, turning away, indicating the conversation was over. She didn't care that her beloved husband was leaving her forever. She knew he had a mistress. More than one person at work had hinted to her that the physical training teacher had often been seen in Edward's company. Once, Molly opened her husband's notebook filled with love poems. All the poems were dedicated to a certain Melanie, who coincidentally worked as a physical training teacher for girls. That's when Molly realized why her husband suddenly became more active at school. However, by that time, she was so tired of such a life that she simply didn't want to arrange a showdown. Molly divorced Edward. Her relatives helped her completely pay off the loan and then called her for a family council. At this council, it was decided that Molly would either leave her job at school or her tutoring work because things could not continue like this. Molly agreed. First of all, she felt indifferent to everything, and secondly, she felt that she was exhausted, so it would be very convenient to finish tutoring or at least refuse several children who did not need classes. Finally, Molly had a little spare time in her life. Once, while cleaning the house, she stood frozen in front of the mirror. She was horrified to see her reflection. She was only 27, but looked 40. Extra weight, bags under her eyes, thin hair, brittle nails. Molly was in shock. It was clear why her husband switched to another girl. Right away, Molly decided to sign up for the gym and beauty salon, and also to the music school to make it less boring. She had some free time and money, so she could afford it. After a year of hard work on herself, Molly saw some results. The extra weight had gone, her skin had become clearer, her hair a bit thicker, and she was getting better with music. But she still constantly felt tired, irritated and dissatisfied. Nevertheless, this did not prevent her from meeting Michael. This time, her boyfriend was hard-working and even helped her around the house. Molly was happy when he proposed to her. Now she did not have to take out a loan, as Michael decided to pay for the wedding himself. A year later, Molly became pregnant and went on maternity leave. Michael was happy and took care of his wife, while Molly adored her husband and already loved their future child. However, she did not pass all the tests in life. The pregnancy was difficult. Molly had to be hospitalized 3 times. The doctor who was monitoring her pregnancy did not understand what was happening. All her tests had insignificant deviations from the norm. Her medical history was collected comprehensively. But what could go wrong? Tell me, have you ever experienced a lack of energy, irritability? Maybe your hair fell out, or you had problems with your skin or internal organs? The consulting gynecologist asked Molly doubtfully after another hospitalization. Yes, I have experienced that, the girl admitted, but at that time I worked a lot and my relationship with my ex-husband was worse than you can imagine, so I think it was all due to stress. Possible, but let's better visit a geneticist, suggested the doctor. Anything can happen and we don't need unnecessary risks. With the baby, everything is fine according to the ultrasound. But don't panic yet. I may be wrong. You just have an atypical course of pregnancy. Obstetrics and gynecology, is a strange subject. Not always everything is as in textbooks. Yes, I understand. Yes, I will try not to get nervous again, agreed Molly. The woman was given a referral to a doctor whom she visited a couple of days later. Molly had to go through some unpleasant procedures, including taking the baby's blood through the umbilical cord. Finally, the results were ready. Molly came to the geneticist's consultation accompanied by her husband. Well, let's start with the good news, said the geneticist, looking at Molly's chart. These words immediately destroyed the woman's weak hope that everything was still fine with her. Your baby is healthy. Thank God, exclaimed Molly, and Michael squeezed her hand. And the bad news? Asked the man. The bad news is that you, Molly, have a rare genetic disease called Fabry disease. It is a progressive disease, so you will have to be treated intensively, but it is not certain that you will be able to overcome all the symptoms, said the doctor. Molly sat quietly, trying not to cry. But why did all this happen to her? What did she do in her life to deserve such punishment? I understand that the situation seems terrible, sighed the doctor, but with modern treatment methods, it will be possible to slow down the process, and you will live a long life. You will receive constant enzyme replacement therapy and almost completely remove the symptoms of the disease. All your pain, problems with your kidneys, these are all symptoms of this disease. But, as I have already noted, fortunately your daughter is healthy. She did not inherit the bad gene, but I advise you not to risk having more children. After leaving the clinic, Molly allowed herself to cry really hard. She had always wanted a big family, but now she was lucky that her only daughter would not suffer from any genetic disease. However, Molly herself would have to undergo therapy all her life. Michael tried to support his wife, but Molly fell into depression. Even the birth of a healthy child did not alleviate her condition much, as she immediately had to start treatment, and they had to buy expensive, artificial formulas for their daughter, which did not please either parent. When their daughter Amy turned 1, Michael couldn't take it anymore. Molly, I'm sorry, but I can't tolerate this anymore. I keep thinking that Amy might have some abnormalities. I just can't go through that. Forgive me. Michael. No, please, not you. Tears appeared in Molly's eyes. Forgive me, repeated Michael, covering his face with his hands. Forgive me, but I don't want a family with defects. Molly didn't understand how she went through the divorce. If it weren't for her mother, who moved in with her daughter to help her with the child, Molly would not have coped. The woman lay and cried for days on end, and her mother had to take care of both Amy and Molly. Life was not just a difficult period, but literally the whole world turned into a huge black hole that sucked out the remnants of Molly's strength every second. And then Amy started having allergies, and they had to switch to more expensive baby food, which Molly's family simply could not afford. Molly had to return to work, but everything slipped out of her hands. Her beloved students did not recognize their teacher, and the director called Molly to the serious talk. "Molly, what's happening to you?" the director asked directly. "I'm just exhausted," Molly admitted. "If you're tired and can't handle the work, maybe it's time to consider a change of profession." "What are you talking about?" Molly couldn't believe her ears. The director sighed. "There are complaints about you. If they continue, I will have to fire you. I can't believe I'm saying these words to you, but try to pull yourself together, please. I understand that you're going through a difficult time, but educating children should not suffer. Please understand me." "I understand," Molly sighed. When she left the director's office, tears rolled down her cheeks. That same evening, Molly went to her mother's house. She wanted to be in an environment that did not remind her of her own life. Molly remembered her childhood. It seemed that just yesterday she was running through those rooms and playing hide-and-seek with her mother, and now her mother was sitting with her daughter and waiting for Molly's return. And now she had an incurable disease, and again has to go through a course of IVs with medicine. The woman bit her lip to keep from crying and went to the old piano, which was something of a family heirloom. Molly's soul was tormented by the pain, which she poured out on the keys, playing her own melody. After finishing playing, she sat at the piano for a couple of minutes, reconciling herself to her fate. There was nothing she could do. She had to get treatment and return to this nightmare where there was no money, no love, no hope. Although, why no love? Molly shook herself. Amy, her daughter, gave her strength and made her mother live for her. And if it weren't for her... Molly's thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. The girl flinched with surprise, but went to open the door. "Who's there?" asked Molly from behind the door. "Excuse me, I'm your new neighbour. I recently bought a flat here," a man's voice said. "I heard the piano and wanted to know what that melody was." Molly opened the door holding the chain. The man at the door did not seem dangerous. He was mature, but looked like he was in his 30s. There was a light grey in his hair, but it made him look younger than he was. "Sorry to bother you," said Molly. "Bother me? No, not at all." The man smiled. "I would love to hear more, but I can't recognize the composer." "You liked it?" Molly was surprised. "Madly," the man smiled. "So, who's the composer?" "Well, me," shrugged Molly uncertainly. "Wow." The man's eyes widened. "You have real talent. You know, I'm a music producer. I hear so many musicians every day, but somehow nothing really touches me. But this is something. I can't even find the words. Could you please play something else? If you feel shy to play in front of me, I can listen from my flat." Molly smiled and stepped back into her flat without any fear. "Please, come in." After listening to Molly's pieces, James, the producer, for several days in a row, persuaded Molly to sign a contract with him and record her works. Finally, Molly decided she had nothing to lose. James now took Molly seriously, and after 2 years, she transformed. She was now a well-known performer and composer, and her music was used in theatres, operas and musicals. Actually, there was no need for Molly to teach anymore. She had a stable, high income from various agencies and contracts. As for James, he fell in love with her, and Molly decided on her 3rd marriage, which turned out to be truly happy for her. James loved Amy as his own daughter, and as Amy didn't know her biological father, she quickly began calling James Dad, which made the producer pleased. Since then, Molly lived happily and practically stopped feeling uncomfortable with taking pills and receiving infusions. The symptoms of the disease no longer bothered her. Once, during one of her concerts, Molly noticed Edward among the audience. He looked at Molly with admiration, but she didn't care. She played her symphony, bowed to the audience, and under the thunderous applause went backstage, where her husband and daughter were waiting for her. "Brilliant as always," James smiled and kissed his wife. "Molly, an admirer came to see you and introduced himself as your ex-husband," one of the guards said. "Wow," Molly smiled. "Well, let him come." "Oh, Molly, lovely Molly." Edward showered her with compliments. "Although I didn't acknowledge any art, but poetry, you were simply magnificent. I am impressed and amazed to the core." "Thank you," Molly coldly smiled. "Did you want to talk about something? I don't have much time." "Oh, I understand," the man smiled. "It's dizzying fame, mountains of money, crowds of fans. Well, it doesn't matter. I'll be brief." He cleared his throat and got on one knee. "Dear Molly, agree to be with me only." "Oh, stop, stop," Molly interrupted. "That's how your ballad began, followed by a marriage proposal. I've heard this before. It seems we got divorced." "Yes, so what?" Edward shrugged. "It's never too late to start from scratch. You let yourself go at that time and I had to leave. I can't be with something ugly. But you are beautiful now. I always knew you were beautiful. It was just a difficult period and you left me." She harshly interrupted him. "You left something ugly in a difficult period. A very chivalrous act." "Molly, you have to understand me. And I forgave you," Edward said. Molly raised her eyebrows, then burst out laughing. "You forgave me? Oh, I can't listen to this anymore. Okay, Edward, get up and don't play the fool. Go to your angelic physical education teacher and don't bother me any more." "But Molly, I love only you." He grabbed her dress. "Besides, she's not my type at all." "Did she refuse to support you?" Molly smiled. "I'm a poet," exclaimed an offended Edward. "I can't work hard in factories. I was born to create, to write. I need inspiration every day." "You know, you're lying about everything. I'm an artist now too, and I have inspiration every day. It's my beloved husband and my beloved daughter, and a person like you need only to be supported and allowed to do nothing. I would never have married you if I had better understood your nature. Let's end it here. All the best to you." "Molly!" Edward exclaimed, trying to run after her, but James blocked his way. "Okay, enough of this circus. Get out of here, or else I'll call the police and send your gentle poet's soul to jail for harassment. Imagine the clientele of that place." Edward quickly gave up, trying to get Molly's attention, and left the backstage as quickly as he appeared. "You had terrible taste," James grinned. "Well, I'm glad I've improved it." Molly smiled and kissed her husband.